Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. In the fall of 2022, as families across Chattanooga, Tennessee prepared for Thanksgiving celebrations, a young woman's life was about to end in the most unimaginable way. This is the story of Jasmine Pace, a 22-year-old whose final act of courage would help solve her own murder. It's a story about a mother's intuition, a family's desperate search, and the dark secrets that lurked behind an apartment door on Tremont Street. On May 29, 2000, Katrina Pace welcomed her daughter Jasmine into the world in Chattanooga. From the moment she arrived, Katrina said her world became brighter. Jasmine, affectionately called Jazzy by everyone who knew her, had a way of lighting up rooms with her presence. She possessed what her family described as a beautiful aura and generous spirit that drew people to her. Growing up in Chattanooga with her parents Katrina and Travis Pace, Jasmine was one of 4 siblings. She had an older sister, Gabby, and brothers Enoch and Travis. Though her parents eventually separated, they maintained an amicable relationship for the sake of their children. Katrina later found love again with Scott Bean, and together they had a son named Aiden. The blended family worked, and the children maintained strong bonds with both parents. But tragedy had already touched this family once before. In August of 2016, when Jasmine was just 16 years old, her brother Travis passed away at the age of 14. The loss devastated the entire family, but they clung to each other through their grief. Finding strength in their unity, it was a pain that never quite left them, a wound that shaped who they became. Jasmine grew into a young woman who loved fiercely and protected those she cared about even more fiercely. She was devoted to her role as an aunt to Paisley Pace and Lily White, and served as godmother to Waylon White. She never missed an opportunity to spend time with them, to be present in their lives in meaningful ways. An animal lover at heart, she cared for 4 cats that she treated like her own children. Friends described her as someone who would always be there when you needed her, ready to share her love and support without hesitation. By November 2022, Jasmine was still finding her way in the world, as most 22-year-olds do. She was petite, standing just 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing 98 pounds. She had brown eyes and black hair, and a tattoo of a panda bear on her left shoulder that held special meaning to her. She dreamed of one day becoming a mother herself, often talking with her sister Gabby about what kind of mother she would be, what values she would instill in her children. What Jasmine's family didn't know was that their daughter had recently met someone through a dating app. His name was Jason Chen, a 22-year-old man living in an apartment complex on Chattanooga's North Shore. The relationship was casual, on and off, the kind of thing that happens when 2 young people are trying to figure out what they want. They had even taken a trip to Chicago together at some point. To Jasmine's family, he was just a male friend, someone their daughter was getting to know. November 2022 would be the last month of Jasmine's life, though she couldn't have known it. The week of Thanksgiving would transform from a time of gratitude and family gathering into a nightmare that would haunt Chattanooga for years to come. Tuesday, November 22nd, 2022 began as a somber day for the Pace family. Katrina's grandmother had passed away, and the family was grieving together. Jasmine was particularly upset by the loss. Death had visited this family before, and each loss reopened old wounds while creating new ones. That evening, after spending time with her mother and family, Jasmine sent a text message to Katrina. She said she was going to stay with a friend for the rest of the week. Katrina found this odd. It was the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. The family had planned. Why would Jasmine suddenly want to be away during the holidays? But grief makes people do strange things, and perhaps Jasmine needed space to process the loss of her great-grandmother in her own way. What happened next would only become clear much later, pieced together from witness testimony, surveillance footage, and cell phone data. Sometime that evening, Jasmine went to Jason Chen's apartment at 11 and 10 Tremont Street, a building just off of Fraser Avenue along Chattanooga's North Shore. The area was typical of urban apartment living, neighbors close enough to hear through walls, security cameras capturing comings and goings, the kind of place where anonymity and community existed in uncomfortable proximity. At 11:27 p.m., Katrina Pace saw her daughter for what would be the last time, near Tremont Street. She had no way of knowing that within hours, everything would change. Around 2 o'clock in the morning on November 23rd, a downstairs neighbor named Courtney Paglino Brewer was jolted awake by a loud scream. She checked her phone to note the time and was about to call 911. Her testimony would later reveal what she heard. A female voice screaming, footsteps running toward the front door, crying. But then things seemed to calm down. She heard what she later realized might have been a garbage disposal running. The sounds of violence had transformed into something more methodical, more calculated. She decided not to call the police. What Courtney didn't know was that behind the walls of apartment 2S10, Jasmine Pace was being murdered. Inside that apartment, Jason Chen attacked Jasmine with a knife. What the medical examiner would later describe as a chef's knife with a relatively broad blade. The wounds all went in the same direction, from right to left, concentrated in one area of her body. Her face, her chin, her scalp, her neck, her head. 60 stab wounds in total. Her jugular vein was cut in half. The blade penetrated her lung and broke off at the rib, going 2 inches into her body. The knife tip would remain lodged in her body, a crucial piece of evidence that would later connect back to a knife found on Chen's bed. The medical examiner, Dr. Cogswell, who had performed over 7,000 autopsies in his career, would later testify that this was not a rapid death. Jasmine died over the course of at least several minutes. Probably closer to 5 minutes, but less than 10. Bleeding heavily onto Chen's carpet, her life slipping away with each passing second. During those final moments, Jasmine did something remarkable. Something that would ultimately lead investigators to her body. At 2:18 a.m., Katrina Pace received a text message from her daughter's phone. It was a location pin, marking the apartment on Tremont Street. The message went unnoticed for some time in the chaos of grief and early morning hours. But that pin, sent while Jasmine was dying, or perhaps just before she lost consciousness, would prove crucial. Her father Travis would later say that his daughter had rescued future victims, that she had solved her own murder with that final act of bravery. After Jasmine died, Jason Chen's actions took on a methodical quality that suggested not panic, but calculation. Surveillance footage from the apartment complex would later show him leaving the building at various times throughout November 23rd, wearing a mask and with black fabric wrapped around his hand. His Ring doorbell camera, along with his downstairs neighbors, captured multiple trips in and out. He went shopping. Surveillance video from 2 different Walmart stores in Chattanooga showed Chen purchasing cleaning supplies. He bought items designed to erase what had happened, to scrub away the evidence of violence from his apartment. Back in his apartment, the cleanup began. Blood on the hardwood floor in the living room. Blood in the bathroom grout. Blood splatter on the bathroom wall. Blood on the bedroom carpet. Broken glass suggesting a violent altercation. Chen worked to eliminate these traces. But blood is stubborn. It seeps into porous materials, leaves microscopic traces that no amount of cleaning can fully remove. Then came the disposal of Jasmine's body. Chen wrapped her 98-pound frame in 3 black trash bags. He handcuffed her wrist to her ankle, the metal cuffs binding her even in death. He placed shackles on her as well, as if she might somehow escape. Then he stuffed her body into a suitcase, forcing her small frame into that confined space. Surveillance footage captured Chen dragging the suitcase out of his apartment. For a brief moment, Jasmine's father Travis would later say he had hoped, when watching that footage, that his daughter was still alive inside, that somehow she had survived. But that hope was a fantasy born of desperate love. Chen loaded the suitcase into his vehicle. His phone's GPS data, which investigators would later track, showed him driving to Suck Creek Road along the Tennessee River. It was a remote area, the kind of place where someone could leave something and hope it wouldn't be found for a long time, if ever. He dumped the suitcase along the banks of the river and drove away, leaving Jasmine's body in that lonely spot. When Jasmine failed to arrive for Thanksgiving, Her family knew something was wrong. This wasn't like her. She never went more than an hour without contacting them, let alone an entire day. The feeling of wrongness grew with each passing hour, a dread that settled into their bones. Katrina tried calling Jasmine's phone, but the calls went unanswered. Then the text messages started coming through from Jasmine's phone, but they didn't sound like her. The messages said she wanted to be alone, that she needed space. One message claimed she was going to visit a friend in South Carolina, but when the family reached out to that friend, they discovered she lived in Kentucky, not South Carolina, and had no plans to see Jasmine. On Jasmine's Facebook page, a post appeared with a photo captioned "Thanksgiving with my baby." The image showed Jasmine wearing clothing that was completely out of character for her. Her family knew immediately that something was very wrong. This wasn't their Jazzy posting on social media. Someone else had access to her phone, to her accounts. Katrina used the My Chevy app to track Jasmine's phone location on the evening of November 23rd. The app led her to the Signal View condominiums off of Mountain Creek Road. There, at 8:27 p.m., she found her daughter's abandoned vehicle. The car seat had been adjusted for someone much taller than Jasmine's 5'2" frame. Another unsettling clue that someone else had been driving her car. The family's anxiety turned to full-blown panic. They began their own investigation because in those early hours they felt the police weren't moving fast enough. Katrina and her ex-husband Travis started talking to people, trying to retrace their daughter's steps. Through those conversations, they learned that Jasmine had a boyfriend they didn't know much about, Jason Chen, and that he lived in an apartment on Tremont Street. On November 26th, the Saturday after Thanksgiving, Katrina and Travis did something that would later become controversial in court proceedings. Unable to wait any longer, driven by a mother's desperate intuition that time was running out, they went to 1110 Tremont Street and forced their way into Jason Chen's apartment. Inside, they found Jasmine's driver's license, her credit cards, personal items that she would never leave behind voluntarily. But they didn't find Jasmine, and they didn't find Jason Chen. A neighbor mentioned hearing a loud disturbance around 2 in the morning on November 22nd. Every new piece of information added to the picture of horror taking shape in their minds. Katrina later testified about calling Chen as she grew increasingly concerned about her daughter's whereabouts. She asked him directly, "Jazzy's missing. Have you seen her?" His response, she said, was immediate and obvious. He started lying. A mother knows when someone isn't telling the truth, especially when her child's life hangs in the balance. That same day, the family met with Chattanooga police investigators in person for the first time. They told them everything about finding the apartment, about the driver's license and credit cards, about the neighbor who heard the disturbance. The police requested and were granted a warrant to search Chen's apartment. When investigators entered the apartment, they found what Katrina and Travis had missed. Blood. Not just a little blood, but blood on the living room hardwood floor, blood in the bathroom grout, blood splatter on the bathroom wall, blood on the bedroom carpet. They found the recently purchased cleaning supplies. They found broken glass and other evidence suggesting a violent altercation. They found a knife on Chen's bed, though they didn't yet know that the tip of this knife was missing, lodged inside Jasmine's body wherever her body might be. On November 27, 2022, the day before Thanksgiving's annual feast, Jason Chen was arrested at his parents' home near Nashville, Tennessee. Police charged him with first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. But there was still no body. The district attorney, Cody Womp, held a news conference that day. Her words were measured but urgent. "Our main concern is Jasmine, her location, where she is. She is our priority. She will continue to be our priority this day forward." Chen was initially taken to jail in Franklin, Tennessee, but was soon transferred back to Hamilton County, where he was held without bond. The affidavit spelling out the evidence was released, and the community of Chattanooga began to understand the horror that had unfolded in their city during what should have been a week of Thanksgiving and gratitude. The Pace family clung to hope, even as that hope dimmed with each passing day. Katrina posted on Facebook, thanking the community for their support. The outpouring of true love and support from the community this past week has meant more than I can explain. But they still didn't have Jasmine. They still didn't know where their daughter was. On December 1st, 2022, 9 days after Jasmine was last seen alive, investigators got the breakthrough they needed. Jason Chen's phone records showed his movements on November 23rd. The cell tower data created a map of where he had gone that day. and one location stood out: Suck Creek Road. Chattanooga police closed down the 1000 block of Suck Creek Road that Thursday afternoon. They wouldn't say why, but word began to spread through the community that something had been found. Detective Stephen Bulkley and other investigators searched the area along the Tennessee River, and there, near the water's edge, they found a suitcase. When Bulkley examined it, he could feel through the fabric what was consistent with a human head's shoulders and the torso. At that point, they were certain they had found Jasmine Pace. The suitcase was carefully transported back to be examined. Layer by layer, the horror was revealed. 3 black trash bags, handcuffs connecting her wrist to her ankle, shackles, and inside all of that, Jasmine's 98-pound body, which had been left in that lonely spot for over a week. The Hamilton County medical examiner performed the autopsy. The report detailed 60 stab wounds concentrated in one area: her face, scalp, chin, head, and neck. The wounds all went in the same direction, from right to left. The knife had gone into her lung, breaking off at the rib, and there, still lodged in her body, was the tip of the murder weapon, a piece that would later match the knife found on Chen's bed. A family member confirmed to media outlets that the body was indeed Jasmine. Katrina and Travis's worst nightmare had been realized. Their daughter was dead, murdered in the most brutal way imaginable, and her body had been discarded like trash. District Attorney Catawamp issued a statement. Our hearts are with Jasmine's family tonight as they deal with unimaginably difficult news. We are grateful that thanks to the hard work of the Chattanooga Police Department, she may now be laid to rest, surrounded by the friends and family that so deeply loved her. The state of Tennessee is focused on prosecuting Jason Chen to the fullest extent of the law. In this case, justice will prevail. On December 5th, 2022, friends and family gathered in Coolidge Park to remember Jasmine. They shared stories, they cried, they celebrated the young woman whose life had been cut so horrifically short. They remembered her generosity, her fierce protectiveness of those she loved, her dreams of becoming a mother someday. They remembered how she lit up rooms with her presence. But even as they mourned, questions remained. Why had Jason Chen killed Jasmine? What had happened in that apartment in the early morning hours of November 23rd? And would Chen ever face true justice for what he had done? It took over 2 years for Jason Chen to face trial. The case was so high profile in Chattanooga that the defense successfully argued for an outside jury. In January 2025, jury selection began in Davidson County at the Justice A.A. Birch Building in Nashville. It took 2 days to select 12 jurors and 4 alternates, all of whom would be sequestered for the duration of the trial to protect them from media influence. On Monday, January 13, 2025, the murder trial finally began. Members of both the Pace and Chen families filled Judge Boyd Patterson's courtroom. The emotional weight of what was to come hung heavy in the air. District Attorney Cuddy Wamp and Chief Homicide Prosecutor Paul Moyle presented the state's opening statement. Wamp began by holding up a piece of evidence that would become iconic in the trial. This is the suitcase in which Jason Chen stuffed the 98-pound body of Jasmine Pace. He stabbed her over and over again. The prosecution's case was built on a mountain of evidence. They presented surveillance footage showing Chen's movements on November 23rd, leaving his apartment multiple times, always wearing a mask with black fabric wrapped around his hand. Footage from Walmart stores showing him purchasing cleaning supplies. His neighbor's Ring camera video capturing his comings and goings. They presented Chen's phone records, showing how cell tower data had led investigators directly to Jasmine's body on Suck Creek Road. Detective Bulkley walked the jury through the process of locating the suitcase, describing how he could feel through the fabric what he knew was a human body. Crime scene investigators detailed the blood evidence found in Chen's apartment. Michelle Johnson testified about the 3 layers of trash bags, the handcuffs, the shackles. The jury saw photos of how Jasmine's body had been discovered, though these images were so disturbing that Judge Patterson warned the courtroom that outbursts would not be tolerated. The medical examiner, Dr. Cogswell, provided testimony about the 60 stab wounds, all concentrated in one area, all going from right to left. He explained how the knife had penetrated Jasmine's lung, how the tip had broken off at her rib. He testified that this was not a rapid death, that Jasmine had suffered for several minutes before dying. Perhaps most damning was the physical evidence connecting Chen to the murder weapon. Investigators presented the knife found on Chen's bed and compared it to the tip found in Jasmine's body during the autopsy. The pieces matched. The prosecution also revealed something that suggested premeditation and obsession. When Chen was arrested at his parents' house in Nolensville, investigators found notes about Jasmine pasted on the walls. These notes contained cryptic information about her childhood, about times she had run away from home. It suggested a level of stalking, of obsessive attention that went beyond a casual dating relationship. Leighton Print Supervisor Sergeant David Franklin testified about fingerprints found on the trash bags used to wrap Jasmine's body. Telecommunications analyst investigator Mark Hamilton detailed Chen's iPhone data, revealing that Chen had swapped out SIM cards and used the Tinder dating app. The picture painted was of someone who, even after murdering his girlfriend, was looking to connect with other women. The prosecution's theory was clear. This was first-degree premeditated murder. Jason Chen had planned to kill Jasmine Pace, had executed that plan with brutal efficiency, and had then taken calculated steps to cover up the crime and dispose of her body. On the first day, Katrina Pace took the stand. It was emotionally devastating for her to walk through the events of November 2022. She described her last conversation with Jasmine, the odd text messages that followed, her growing panic as hours turned into days. She testified about forcing her way into Chen's apartment and finding her daughter's identification and credit cards. She spoke about calling Chen and knowing immediately that he was lying to her. Her testimony was powerful because it reminded everyone that Jasmine wasn't just evidence in a case. She was someone's daughter, sister, aunt, friend. She was love. The defense, led by attorney Josh Weiss, took a different approach. On the sixth day of trial, they began presenting their case. Weiss did something unexpected. He admitted that Jason Chen had killed Jasmine Pace. There was no denying it. The evidence was overwhelming. But Weiss argued this wasn't first-degree murder. He claimed it was voluntary manslaughter, a crime of passion rather than premeditated murder. According to the defense's theory, Jasmine had discovered that Jason was talking to other girls. She became angry and allegedly attacked him with a wine bottle. Jason, Weiss claimed, stabbed her in response, and then lost consciousness. When he came to, he found Jasmine unconscious. The defense argued that what happened next, the cleanup, the disposal of the body, was the result of panic, not premeditation. The defense called Courtney Paglino Brower, Chen's downstairs neighbor, who testified about being woken by a scream around 2 a.m. She described hearing a female voice screaming, footsteps running toward the front door, and crying. Under cross-examination, Prosecutor Wamp asked a pointed question. Approximately how long after you heard the scream did you hear the garbage disposal? The question hung in the air, suggesting that Chen had used the disposal to get rid of evidence. The defense also questioned whether all the evidence had been tested. They pointed out that not every piece of potential evidence from the crime scene had undergone forensic analysis. They tried to cast doubt on the thoroughness of the investigation. Josh Weiss spent hours questioning the Pace family about their searches of Chen's apartment, trying to argue that his client's Fourth Amendment rights had been violated by what he characterized as an illegal search. This strategy frustrated the family, who felt that the focus should be on Jasmine's murder, not on technicalities about how evidence was obtained. Jasmine's sister Gabriella testified about the family's desperate search, describing encounters with police where there was a lot of male testosterone, like trying to voice over each other. The family had felt neglected, desperate, racing against time to find Jasmine when they still believed she might be alive. Travis Pace, Jasmine's father, pleaded with Weiss during cross-examination, explaining why memories might be confused. Walking away 2 days before Thanksgiving after her grandmother died, and then surprises her with an instant death that they didn't anticipate, and then they have to go looking for Jasmine. Yeah, if her testimony is shaky, I fully understand why. The defense called Chen's mother to the stand. Xiufang Chen's testimony was emotional, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her son. It was a reminder that this tragedy had rippled out to affect multiple families, though the Pace family noted bitterly that Chen's parents had allegedly provided him with money and information in the days after the murder, when he was the prime suspect. Throughout the trial, Jason Chen sat quietly, often with his head bowed, especially during the medical examiner's testimony. He chose not to take the stand in his own defense, a decision that would later frustrate the Pace family, who felt they deserved to hear him explain, apologize, show some remorse. In closing arguments, Chief Prosecutor Paul Moyle asked the jury to consider how many opportunities Chen had to stop. Mr. Chen accelerated, kept going, didn't stop. I want you to keep that as you are going through the proof. How many opportunities did Mr. Chen have to take the off-ramp away from violence? away from murder, away from 60 stab wounds. District Attorney Cody Womp spoke passionately about remembering the victim. Victims matter. Jasmine Pace is not just some girl listed in an autopsy report. She is not the photos that you have seen. Don't minimize her to a name on an indictment. The defense maintained that while Chen had killed Jasmine, the evidence for premeditation wasn't strong enough. They asked the jury to consider a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. On January 20th, 2025, after 7 days of testimony, the jury began deliberations at 4:12 p.m. Just 44 minutes later, at 4:56 p.m., they returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, guilty of abuse of a corpse. The gallery erupted in cheers. The Pace family wept with relief and grief. Jason Chen showed no visible reaction. The next day, January 21st, 2025, the same jury that had convicted Chen was tasked with determining his sentence. While he didn't face the death penalty, they had to decide whether he would serve life in prison with the possibility of parole after 50 years, or life without any possibility of parole. Before the jury made their decision, members of Jasmine's family were given the opportunity to deliver victim impact statements. It was their chance to confront the man who had taken Jasmine from them. Jacqueline White, Jasmine's cousin, approached the front of the courtroom carrying a container. One by one, she dropped 60 stones into it, each stone representing one of Jasmine's stab wounds. The sound of each stone hitting the container echoed through the silent courtroom. She referred to Chen as a subhuman villain and predatory sociopath. White spoke about the images she couldn't get out of her mind. I have to force myself to remember her beautiful words and not her tiny wrists with handcuffs rusting over that tattoo. She asked the question everyone wondered. How are you such a coward that you have to bind a 98-pound innocent female and give her no chance of fighting back? That question brings me some comfort, knowing how weak, impotent, and scared you are. Gabby Pace, Jasmine's older sister, delivered an emotional statement about how Jasmine had always wanted children of her own. How she used to talk about what kind of mother she would be. That dream would never be realized now, Gabby reminded the court. For all of the trauma that Jazzy endured, she still had the most beautiful aura and soul. She never gave up on other people, and she never gave up on herself. The defense made one final plea, asking the jury to consider giving Chen the possibility of parole after 50 years. His attorney argued, "You are not tasked with forgiving Jason Chen or even excusing his actions. You are tasked with ensuring justice, a justice tempered with mercy, not because Jason deserves it, but because it is a reflection of our humanity as a whole. We ask that you give Jason the opportunity as a 73-year-old man to get this redemption. Let him spend the next 5 decades reflecting on the choices he made when he was 22 years old." The jury took less than an hour to reach their decision. They unanimously chose life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jason Chen, at 23 years old, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He would never walk free again. District Attorney Cody Womp spoke to the media afterward. There are murderers. And then there's Jason Chen. It is the next level of murder. It is depravity. I hope in this county we never see any case like it. That's why it was so impactful on this community and why everyone has been following it. We have homicides here. Most of them are shootings, that's no secret. This hits different. Womp emphasized what the case had always been about. We really do need to make these cases about victims. They have families. They matter. That's the easiest way to say it. For the Pace family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but it couldn't bring Jasmine back. Travis Pace later told reporters that he didn't feel like justice had been truly served. Not really. The verdict was right. The sentence was right, but nothing could undo what had been done. It's complicated, he said. No, I don't think I felt justice was served. What bothered him most was that Chen never took the stand, never apologized, never showed remorse. Take the stand and apologize. Say you're sorry. Look the jury in the face and say, "I now know what I did was wrong," Travis said. To not say what happened also took our closure of the only remaining survivor that knows the exact sequence of events. Travis spoke about imagining the events of November 23rd during the trial, about how seeing Chin in court allowed him to picture what his daughter had endured. He called Chin's defense theory absurd. The idea that Jasmine, a 5'2", 98-pound woman, had somehow posed enough of a threat to a 6'3" man that he needed to stab her 60 times to defend himself. There's zero indication that a 6'3" man with arm reach and distance and height and weight advantage, who's already kicked a girl down that was holding a wine bottle, would feel intimidated or scared enough to run, he said. But Travis also spoke about his daughter's final act of courage. That location pin she sent to her mother in those last moments. He believed it might have saved future victims. She rescued future victims. He said. One of the jurors later told media outlets that in many ways Jasmine Pace had solved her own murder by sending that location pin. It was her breadcrumb trail, her way of making sure that even if she didn't survive, the truth would come out. The case didn't end with the criminal trial. Jasmine's mother filed a $17 million wrongful death lawsuit against Jason Chen, and his parents accusing them of harboring Chen and providing him with money and information in the days after the murder when he was the prime suspect. The lawsuit alleged that Chen's parents had helped him evade justice, even temporarily. The civil case continued to wind through the courts, another chapter in a tragedy that had already claimed so much. Today, Katrina Pace still lives in Chattanooga with her partner Scott Bean and their son Aiden. She remains deeply involved in advocacy for victims' families, sharing Jasmine's story with others who have faced similar tragedies. She has a panda tattoo now, matching the one Jasmine had on her shoulder. A permanent reminder of the daughter she lost. A way to keep Jazzy close. Katrina finds joy in her grandchildren, Paisley Pace and Lily White, and in her pets Coco and Jack. In 2024, she and her family took a trip to Puerto Rico, embracing life's small meaningful moments, while carrying the weight of Jasmine's absence. Not a day goes by that she doesn't miss her daughter. The pain hasn't eased with time. She's simply learned to carry it. Travis Pace channeled his grief into purpose. As a former Air Force officer, he understands discipline and mission focus. He now serves as CEO and founder of multiple companies. Wealth Financial Investing Group, Hodges & Pace LLC, and Operation Support IDF. These ventures focus on financial investment, real estate, and supporting Israel through investment. He lives in Chattanooga and works to build a life that would make Jasmine proud. She had enormous potential, he said. Capabilities that would never be realized now. But he could honor her memory by living well, by being someone she would be proud to call her father. Jason Chen sits in prison, where he will remain for the rest of his life. He never explained why he killed Jasmine. He never apologized. The truth of what happened in that apartment in the early hours of November 23, 2022 died with Jasmine, and Chen has chosen to take his version of events to the grave with him. The case sparked conversations in Chattanooga and beyond about domestic violence, about the dangers of dating in the digital age, about how quickly casual relationships can turn deadly. It reminded people to trust their instincts, to reach out if they feel unsafe, to send location pins to loved ones if something feels wrong. Jasmine's story became a reminder that true crime isn't just entertainment. It's real people, real families, real grief that never ends. Behind every case is someone who was loved, who had dreams, who should still be here. On quiet nights in Chattanooga, when the Tennessee River flows past Suck Creek Road, some people think about Jasmine Pace. They think about a 22-year-old woman who loved her cats, who wanted to be a mother someday, who lit up rooms with her presence. They think about her final act of bravery, sending that location pin even as she was dying, making sure the truth would come out. Her family made sure that Jasmine Pace would not be reduced to a name in an autopsy report or a sensational headline. She was Jazzy generous, fierce, protective, full of potential. She was loved more than words can describe. And though she's gone, her memory lives on in the hearts of everyone who knew her. Some victims' stories end in darkness. But Jasmine Pace's story, for all its horror, ends with a different truth. That love endures beyond death. That families fight for justice even when the world seems impossibly dark. And that sometimes in their final moments, the bravest among us find a way to help solve their own murders. And potentially save others from the same fate. Rest in peace, Jasmine Jazzy Pace. May 29, 2000, November 23, 2022. Your light was extinguished far too soon, but it burns on in the memories of all who loved you. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Sometimes the most ordinary moments can become the setting for unspeakable tragedy. On a warm spring night in May 2024, two friends sat beside a small fire on a beach in Dorset, England. Watching the full moon rise over the water, they had no way of knowing that someone was watching them from the shadows. Someone who had traveled nearly 100 miles with a single, terrible purpose. This is the story of Amy Gray, and how a seemingly random attack on Bournemouth Beach revealed one of the most chilling criminal minds in recent British history. Amy Gray was 34 years old in the spring of 2024. She lived in Poole, a coastal town in Dorset, with her wife Shian and their daughter. Those who knew Amy described her as a force of nature. Her mother, Sharon Macklin, would later say that when Amy entered a room, it filled with laughter. Her presence couldn't be ignored. She had a big smile and a giggly laugh that made people around her feel instantly at ease. Amy worked as a personal trainer, dedicated to helping others achieve their fitness goals. But her passion extended beyond individual clients. She served as the women's head coach at Dorset Futsal Club, where she guided and inspired female athletes in the fast-paced indoor variation of soccer. Amy was beautiful inside and out, her family said. She was funny, kind, and energetic, a larger-than-life character who touched countless lives in her community. She was also deeply devoted to her family. Xian would later describe her as the most loving wife and mother anyone could ask for. At 36 years old, Xian couldn't imagine life without her partner. They had built a life together in their small seaside town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. On the night of May 24th, 2024, Amy made plans to meet her close friend Leanne Miles at Durley Chummy Beach. Leanne was 38, also from Poole, and the two women had decided to enjoy the unusually warm evening together. It was a Friday night, and the forecast promised clear skies. A full moon would rise over the English Channel, and they wanted to watch it together. They arrived at the beach carrying wood for a small fire. Durley Chain Beach sits along Bournemouth's famous 7-mile stretch of golden sand. During the day, it bustles with tourists and locals. Beach huts line the promenade and families spread out across the shore. But at night, especially late at night, the beach becomes quiet, peaceful. The kind of place where two friends could sit by a fire, talk, and simply exist without the noise of everyday life. By 11:30 that night, the fire crackled softly between them. The moon hung low over the water, casting silver light across the waves. Amy and Leanne talked and laughed, wrapped in the simple comfort of friendship. Neither woman noticed the figure approaching from the promenade. Neither woman heard the footsteps crossing the sand until it was far too late. To understand what happened on that beach, we need to travel backward in time and northward to London, to a young man who, on the surface, seemed unremarkable. His name was Nassim Sadi, born on December 22nd, 2003. Nassim grew up in Croydon, a large town in South London. His childhood was marked by isolation. As his defense lawyer would later describe in court, Nassim was what some might call a social misfit. He had hardly any friends at school. He never had a girlfriend. He seemed to be someone other students avoided rather than sought out. While his peers formed friendships and relationships, Nassim remained on the periphery, watching from a distance. This isolation bred something dark inside him. A deeply suppressed rage. A resentment toward society as a whole. And toward women in particular. He felt humiliated by rejection. Every romantic advance he made was rebuffed. Every attempt to connect with others seemed to confirm his worst fears about himself. Rather than seeking help or finding healthy ways to cope, Nason turned inward, nurturing his anger until it became something else entirely. Something dangerous. In the autumn of 2023, Nason enrolled at the University of Greenwich to study physical education, but he struggled with the coursework. He would later tell police that he wasn't good enough to progress. He failed. So he switched to a different program, criminology and criminal psychology. It seemed like an ordinary choice. Many students are drawn to the study of crime, fascinated by the psychology of criminals and the mechanics of law enforcement. But for Nazan, this wasn't an academic interest. It was research. His lecturers began to notice something unusual about him. During seminars, Nazan would ask questions that seemed oddly specific and strangely disconnected from the material being taught. Dr. Lisa Maria Reyes, one of his instructors, remembered a particular incident vividly. She had been teaching a class on political structures in the UK when Nazan started asking questions about murder. He wanted to know about DNA analysis, about forensic evidence, about how someone might justify killing as self-defense. How often would such a defense succeed in court? What were the legal parameters? The questions kept coming, increasingly focused, increasingly troubling. Dr. Reese, who had served as a special officer for the Metropolitan Police, tried to redirect him. She explained that his questions weren't relevant to the current lecture and that there would be time later in the course for discussions about criminal investigation. Then she asked him directly, "You're not planning a murder, are you?" Nazan didn't reply. He simply sat there in silence. Later, Dr. Reese's partner, Pavandeep Singh Anaya, also a special police officer, came to speak with the class in November 2023. Nazan peppered him with questions too, but these were different from what other students asked. While his classmates inquired about work-life balance and career paths, Nazan focused obsessively on procedures following a murder. What steps would police take? What kind of forensic evidence would they look for? How long does DNA remain on objects? When Dr. Reese jokingly asked again if he was planning a murder, Nazan claimed he was researching for an article. He wanted to enter a competition for a paper that would win him £500. It sounded plausible enough. Or perhaps it was easier to believe that than to imagine the truth. But Nazan wasn't preparing an academic article. He was preparing for something far more sinister. While attending his criminology classes, Nazan cultivated a private obsession. He was fascinated by knives. Not as tools or collectibles, but as weapons. Between March and May of 2024, he purchased 6 blades from various websites. A machete, ornamental knives, combat-style blades. He stored some at his aunt's house in Croydon, where he was living, and others at his parents' home. He created online personas that reflected his dark interests. On Snapchat, he called himself Ninja Killer. On his computer, he used the username nskills. These weren't jokes or teenage bravado. They were expressions of his true self, the identity he was building in secret. His internet search history revealed the depth of his obsession. He researched famous murder cases. He studied the killing of Millie Dowler, the 13-year-old British girl who was abducted and murdered in 2002. He looked into the case of Brianna Gay, a 16-year-old transgender girl who was stabbed to death in a park in February 2023 by 2 teenagers. But Nazan wasn't just studying these crimes out of morbid curiosity. He was learning from them. In March 2024, he searched for why is it harder for a killer to be caught if he does it in another town. He researched the merits of different weapons, which was more effective. Swords, daggers, or knives. He searched for which is the deadliest knife and machete. He also thought about logistics, about how to avoid detection. His searches included what hotels don't have CCTV, and queries about hotels that accepted cash payment. He was building a plan piece by piece, search by search, and then his research became more specific. He started looking into Bournemouth, a seaside resort town in Dorset about 90 miles southwest of London. He had never been there before, but something about it appealed to him. Perhaps it was the sandy beach. Perhaps it was the distance from home. Perhaps it was simply that Bournemouth seemed like a place where he could carry out his plan without being recognized. He researched how many people visited Bournemouth Beach. He looked into whether the beach was open at night. He studied the area through online maps and images, familiarizing himself with the geography. Bournemouth became his chosen hunting ground. During this time, Nazan also indulged his love of horror movies. He was particularly drawn to slasher films, those violent narratives where killers stalk and murder unsuspecting victims. These weren't just entertainment for him. They were instruction manuals. They fed the fantasy that was rapidly becoming a plan. By May 2024, Nazan had made his decision. He knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to know what it felt like to take a life. Perhaps he wanted to make women feel afraid. Perhaps he thought it would make him feel powerful. make him interesting to others. Or perhaps, as the prosecution would later suggest, he simply couldn't bear to see people engaged in happy, normal social interaction. It enraged him. It reminded him of everything he couldn't have. So he decided to lash out, to hurt, to butcher. On May 21st, 2024, Nassim Sadi left Croydon and traveled to Bournemouth. He had booked accommodations at 2 different locations for a 4-night stay. First, he checked into a Travelodge hotel. Later, he would also book a room at the Silver Howe guest house. He was establishing a presence in the town, settling in before he acted. He packed carefully for this trip. In his blue trespass rucksack, he placed white latex gloves, a black balaclava, a torch, wet wipes, tissues, packets of chili peppers, and of course a knife. For nights, Nassim walked the Bournemouth seafront. He conducted what investigators would later describe as rexes, reconnaissance missions to familiarize himself with the area. He walked along the promenade in the darkness, observing the layout, identifying the best locations, planning his approach. The beach at Durley Chine particularly interested him. It was accessible, relatively isolated at night, and offered multiple escape routes. During the day, he tried to blend in with the tourists. CCTV cameras captured him shopping at Superdrug and at a Nisa convenience store. He appeared calm, unremarkable, just another visitor enjoying Bournemouth. On the evening of May 23rd, Nazan went to the cinema. The movie he chose was telling The Strangers Chapter 1, a reboot of the 2008 home invasion horror film. The plot revolves around a young couple terrorized by masked killers who attack them without apparent motive. In the film, both leads are stabbed. The male character dies. The female survives. Was Nazan seeking inspiration? Was he rehearsing the violence in his mind while watching it play out on screen? The prosecution would later suggest that he gravitated toward what he liked to watch, or that he sought encouragement from what he saw. Either way, the timing is chilling. Less than 24 hours later, he would enact his own horror movie on a moonlit beach. May 24th, 2024. A Friday night. The air was warm, unusual for late spring in England. The full moon rose over the English Channel, painting the water in shades of silver and black. Amy Gray and Leanne Miles sat by their small fire on Durley Chine Beach. They talked, they laughed, they watched the moon climb higher in the sky. At approximately 11:30 p.m., Nazan Sadi left his accommodation and walked toward the beach. He moved slowly, stealthily, quietly. He stayed at the edges of the promenade, hovering in the shadows where the streetlights couldn't quite reach. He watched the 2 women by the fire. He waited. Then, at 11:40 p.m., he made his move. He stepped down from the promenade onto the sand. He walked directly toward Amy and Leanne with a knife in his hand. There was no warning, no provocation, no demands for money or valuables. He simply attacked. His first target was Leanne Miles. The blade struck again and again. Leanne, in shock and terror, felt the knife pierce her body. Once, twice, 3 times. The blows kept coming. She sustained injuries to her lung and liver. Blood spread across the sand. The pain was indescribable. But then something happened that Nazan hadn't anticipated. Amy Gray, seeing her friend being butchered, didn't freeze. She didn't run. Instead, she acted. She shouted at the attacker. "Get away," she screamed. "Get away from her." Amy's shouting distracted Nazan just long enough for Leanne to break free. Despite her injuries, despite the blood loss, despite the excruciating pain, Leanne ran. She fled across the sand, toward help, toward any chance of survival. But Amy's courageous act came at a terrible cost. Nazan turned his attention to her, and the violence that followed was swift and brutal. He stabbed Amy 10 times. The wounds were deep, inflicted with what forensic pathologist Dr. Basil Perdue would later describe as severe force. One blow penetrated Amy's breastbone and struck her pericardial sac, the protective membrane surrounding the heart. The damage was catastrophic. The pericardial sac filled with blood, preventing Amy's heart from beating effectively. Other wounds cut through her body. She tried to defend herself. Defensive wounds on her arms showed that she had raised her hands to protect herself. But it wasn't enough. The entire attack lasted only minutes. Then Nazan Sadi disappeared into the night, leaving Amy Gray dying on the beach and Leanne Miles running for her life. At 11:42 p.m., Dorset police received reports of a stabbing on Durleychin Beach. Officers and paramedics rushed to the scene. What they found was horror. Amy Gray lay on the sand, surrounded by blood. Despite the best efforts of emergency responders, there was nothing they could do. The injuries were too severe, the blood loss too great. Amy was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 34 years old, a wife, a mother, a coach, a friend, and now, the victim of a senseless murder. Leanne Miles, meanwhile, had managed to reach help despite suffering 20 stab wounds. 20. The fact that she survived is nothing short of miraculous. She was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons worked to repair the damage. Her lung had been punctured, her liver had been damaged, but she lived. Later, when Leanne was strong enough to speak, when she was informed of Amy's death, she told investigators something profound. She said that Amy Gray had saved her life. By distracting the attacker, by shouting and drawing his attention away, Amy had given Leanne those crucial seconds she needed to escape. It was Amy's final act of love, her final act of courage. Police immediately launched a murder investigation. They cordoned off a large section of the beach, from Bournemouth Pier to the western side of Ulumchin. Officers canvassed the area, speaking with witnesses, collecting evidence. The investigation moved quickly. Within days, detectives had identified CCTV footage showing a young man walking along the promenade in the nights leading up to the attack. And on the night itself, the footage was grainy, but clear enough. It showed someone conducting reconnaissance, someone who appeared to be waiting for the right moment at the right victims. On May 28th, 4 days after the murder, police arrested a 20-year-old man from Croydon, South London. His name was Nazan Sadi. When officers Nazan's bedroom and his aunt's house in Croydon, they found exactly what they feared they would find. 5 knives, including a machete and ornamental blades, a self-defense spray, and a blue trespass rucksack. Inside the rucksack, white latex gloves, 2 of them turned inside out, a black balaclava, a torch, used wet wipes, tissues, and 2 packets of chili peppers. This was his murder kit, the tools he had assembled for his attack, but the murder weapon itself was missing. Nazan had disposed of the knife he used to kill Amy Gray, and it has never been recovered. His computer and phone revealed the extent of his research. All those searches about knives and murder and hotels without CCTV, all the evidence of planning and preparation, his Snapchat account with the name Ninja Killer, his computer username and skills. The pieces came together quickly. In his police interview on May 30th, Nazan answered most questions with no comments, but he did offer some information. He admitted he had changed from physical education to criminology because he had failed his first course. He said he wasn't good enough to progress. He claimed he had an interest in true crime, unsolved cases, and horror movies. As if this explained everything. When detectives showed him CCTV footage of the attack, Nazan said simply, "That's not me." When they pressed him about his presence in Bournemouth, he couldn't or wouldn't explain his whereabouts during the time of the murder. He suggested he might have blacked out. He claimed he had been drinking, and that was why he couldn't remember. The next thing he remembered, he said, was waking up at home. But the evidence told a different story. The CCTV footage, the internet searches, the knives, the equipment in his backpack, witness statements, all that pointed to careful, methodical planning. This was not a blackout. This was not a mistake. This was murder, premeditated and executed, with chilling precision. Nazan also refused to provide the PIN code for his mobile phone, claiming it was an invasion of privacy. He would later plead guilty to failing to comply with the police notice. But the damage was done. The evidence against him was overwhelming, even without his phone. On June 1st, 2024, Nazan Sadi was formally charged with the murder of Amy Gray and the attempted murder of Leanne Miles. He was remanded in custody to await trial. The trial began in early December 2024 at Winchester Crown Court. Nazan Sadi, now 21 years old, sat in the dock wearing a gray sweatshirt and glasses. Throughout the proceedings, he showed no emotion. Sarah Jones KC, the lead prosecutor, laid out the case for the jury. She described how Nazan had spent weeks researching methods of murder, how he had asked his university lecturers disturbing questions about getting away with killing someone, how he had purchased knives, and planned his trip to Bournemouth with meticulous care. She argued that Nazen's motive was simple and chilling. He wanted to know what it felt like to take a life. Perhaps he wanted to make women feel afraid. Perhaps he thought it would make him feel powerful, or interesting, or perhaps he just couldn't bear to see people engaged in happy, normal social interaction. And he decided to lash out, to hurt, to butcher. The prosecution presented Dr. Basil Perdue, the Home Office pathologist who had examined Amy's body. He explained the injuries in clinical detail. 10 stab wounds, 1 to the heart. The force required to penetrate the breastbone, the defensive wounds on her arms. He stated plainly that any stab wound is potentially very dangerous, but the injuries Amy sustained were rapidly fatal. He also described Leanne Miles's injuries. 20 stab wounds, damage to her lung and liver. The blade had been between 5 and 7 centimeters long. It was a miracle she survived. Lectures from the University of Greenwich testified about Nazen's strange questions and his obsessive interest in crime and violence. Dr. Lisa Maria Rees recounted asking him if he was planning a murder, and how he had failed to respond. The jury viewed CCTV footage showing Nazen walking along the Bournemouth promenade on multiple nights. They saw him conducting his reconnaissance, choosing his location, preparing for the attack. They heard audio recordings of screaming at approximately 11:39 p.m. on May 24th, a male voice. Then silence. They also heard a recording of the 999 call made by Leanne Miles. Her voice, breaking with pain and terror, crying for help. It was almost unbearable to listen to. The defense, led by Charles Sherrod, KC, argued that Nazen was a deeply troubled young man, a social misfit who had been rejected and humiliated throughout his life. He had no friends in school. He had never had a girlfriend. He was someone other people avoided. This isolation had caused what Sherrod described as repressed socially induced trauma. Years of rejection had built up inside Nazen, creating a deeply suppressed rage. The defense acknowledged that there could never be an excuse for what Nazen had done, but they tried to explain his mindset. They said that after his conviction, Nazen had recognized his guilt and demonstrated a willingness to receive therapy, but Nazen himself chose not to testify. He maintained his denial throughout the trial, claiming it was a case of mistaken identity. He suggested he must have blacked out. He said he wasn't there, but the evidence was simply too strong. On December 19th, 2024, after deliberating, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty of murder. Guilty of attempted murder. Nazen Sadi showed no reaction. On March 28, 2025, Nazen Sadi returned to Winchester Crown Court for sentencing. Mrs. Justice Cutts presided over the hearing. She had ordered sentencing reports after the guilty verdict, wanting to understand the full picture before determining Nazen's punishment. Before the sentence was handed down, the court heard victim impact statements. These are among the most difficult moments in any trial. The families of victims are given the opportunity to speak, to describe their loss, to make the court understand what has been taken from them. Sheehan Gray, Amy's wife, read her statement. Her voice was steady, but the pain was evident in every word. She said that at the age of 36, she should not have to hold her deceased wife's cold hand. Her daughter should not have to say goodbye to her mother and grieve over a coffin. The tragedy, Sian explained, had been a public display for everyone to see. In their small town, there was no privacy. They couldn't hide their grief. It had been taken away from them. Amy's beautiful life, full of laughter and love and light, had now been reduced to forever being remembered as the murder victim. The pain in those words was immeasurable. Sharon Macklin, Amy's mother, also spoke. She described her daughter as an amazing, funny, kind, and energetic soul. Amy had a big smile and a loud laugh. When she entered a room, it filled with laughter, and her presence couldn't be ignored. The family's hearts were forever broken. Mrs. Justice Cutts listened to these statements. Then she addressed Nazen Sadi directly. She said that the clear evidence showed he had planned to kill, and had gone to Bournemouth to do exactly that. She stated that she was satisfied he had chosen Amy Gray and Leanne Miles because he had a grievance against society as a whole, and against women in particular. The attacks were not random in the sense of being impulsive. They were the result of careful planning. The victims were randomly selected only in that Nasen had never met them before. But he had traveled to Bournemouth with murder in his heart, and Amy and Leanne simply had the misfortune of being in his path. Mrs. Justice Cutts noted that Nasen had denied his guilt because he wanted the notoriety of the trial. He wanted the attention. He wanted to be seen as someone interesting, someone worth talking about. He showed a complete lack of remorse. She described him as an extremely dangerous individual, with deep-seated issues regarding women. His feelings of humiliation and rejection had festered over years, creating a rage that eventually exploded into violence. Then she pronounced the sentence: life imprisonment. Nasen Sadi would serve a minimum term of 39 years and 65 days before he would be eligible for parole. He was also given concurrent sentences for the attempted murder of Leanne Miles, 30 years, and for failing to provide his phone pin to police, 21 months. Nasen Sadi, wearing a blue sweatshirt and glasses, showed no emotion as the sentence was read. He simply stared ahead, as blank and empty as he had been throughout the trial. In the days and weeks following the sentencing, the people of Bournemouth and Poole struggled to process what had happened in their community. Tributes appeared on the beach where Amy died. Flowers, candles, messages of love and grief. The seaside town, known for its holiday atmosphere and golden sands, had become the scene of one of the most shocking murders in recent memory. Benjamin May, the senior Crown prosecutor with CPS Wessex, released a statement after the sentencing. He said that Amy Gray had lost her life in the most tragic way. He emphasized that Amy's courageous final act to protect her friend truly defined who she was, and that her life would forever be remembered for the love and protection she gave to her loved ones. He also praised Leanne Miles for her bravery through the ordeal, which had helped deliver justice. He stated plainly that Sadie's perverse fascination with murder and violence had morphed into vile real-world consequences, for which he had now faced justice. Detective Inspector Mark Jenkins of Dorset Police Major Crime Investigation Team also spoke publicly. He explained how the investigation team had worked closely with prosecutors to build the strongest possible case. They were able to show how carefully Nasen had planned his attack, intending to kill, choosing Bournemouth, somewhere he had never been before, seemingly purely because it had a sandy beach. He had traveled there days in advance with the intention of committing a horrific act. Detective Inspector Jenkins noted that Nasen had targeted Amy and Leanne, complete strangers, simply because he saw an opportunity to surprise and overpower them. They were two women enjoying a peaceful evening on the beach, and that alone made them targets in Nasen's eyes. Jenkins thanked Amy's family and Leanne for their support throughout the investigation and court process, and for the dignified way they had conducted themselves during an extremely difficult period. The case raised difficult questions about early warning signs and intervention. Nasen's lecturers had asked him directly if he was planning a murder. Should they have reported their concerns to authorities? Could this tragedy have been prevented? These are questions without easy answers, questions that haunt everyone involved. The case also highlighted the particular danger of men who harbor deep resentment toward women. Nasen Sadi wasn't rejected once or twice. He experienced repeated social isolation and romantic rejection throughout his adolescence and young adulthood. Instead of seeking therapy or support, he allowed that rejection to fester into hatred. The judge explicitly stated that he chose his victims because of his grievance against women. This was, in its purest form, an act of misogynistic violence. As for Leanne Miles, she survived, but she will carry the physical and emotional scars of that night for the rest of her life. She endured 20 stab wounds. She watched her friend die trying to save her. She will never forget Amy's courage, or the horror of those moments on the beach. In the aftermath, she told investigators that Amy had saved her life. Those words carry enormous weight. Amy Gray, in her final moments, made a choice. She could have run. She could have tried to save herself. Instead, she fought to protect her friend. She gave Leanne those precious seconds needed to escape, and she paid for that choice with her life. The story of Amy Gray is a tragedy in the truest sense. A life full of promise cut short by senseless violence. A loving wife and mother. A dedicated coach and trainer. A woman whose presence filled rooms with laughter. All of it taken away in minutes of brutal, calculated violence. Nasen Sadi will spend the next 4 decades behind bars. At minimum, he will be in his early 60s before he has any chance of release. The judge made it clear that he poses an extreme danger to the public, particularly to women. His anger, his resentment, his obsession with violence. None of it has gone away. Imprisonment will contain him, but it cannot undo what he has done. For Shian Gray, for Amy's mother Sharon, for their daughter, for Leanne Miles, and for all the friends and family members who loved Amy, life will never be the same. They must carry on knowing that Amy's death was random only in the sense that she happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. She became a target simply because she was a woman, sitting on a beach, living her life, refusing to live in fear. But perhaps there is something else we can take from this story, something beyond the horror and grief. We can remember Amy's courage. In the moment when many would freeze or flee, she acted. She shouted. She drew the killer's attention away from her friend. She made a split-second decision that cost her everything but saved another life. That is the definition of heroism. Not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. Not saving yourself, but saving others. The Dorset community will not forget Amy Gray. Her family will not forget her. And now, through this story, perhaps you will remember her too. Not as the murder victim, as Xian so painfully described, but as Amy, the woman with the giggly laugh and the big smile, the coach who inspired young athletes, the wife who loved deeply, the friend who gave everything to protect someone she cared about. That night on Bournemouth Beach, under the full moon, something terrible happened. But in the darkness of that terrible act, there was also light. The light of Amy Gray's courage. The light of her love. The light of a person who, when faced with the worst that humanity has to offer, chose selflessness over self-preservation. She will not be forgotten. Rest in peace, Amy Gray. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're traveling to Green Bay, Wisconsin, a place known more for its football team than for tragedy. But on a spring weekend in 2016, something happened there that would shake the entire community to its core. This is the story of Nicole Vanderhayden, a young mother whose night out ended in unimaginable horror, and how cutting-edge technology would eventually bring her killer to justice. Nicole Danielle Meyer was born on March 29th, 1985 in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Her family called her Nikki. Growing up, she was surrounded by love. Her parents Vicky and Steve, her sister Heather, and her brothers Brent and Brandon. Friends would later describe Nikki as having a warm, vibrant spirit, the kind of person who lit up a room when she walked in. After graduating from Denmark High School in 2003, Nikki pursued her passion for education at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. She earned a double major in science and education, graduating in 2010. For the next 6 years, she worked as a substitute teacher in the Green Bay area public schools. She had a gift for connecting with students, especially when teaching science. Former students remembered her patience, her enthusiasm, and the way she made learning feel less like work and more like discovery. Nikki's personal life had its share of ups and downs. She married young and had 2 children, Michaela and Tyler, but the marriage didn't work out. Like so many young people, she picked up the pieces and moved forward. And then she met Douglas Detree. Friends called him Doug. The relationship moved quickly. Within 2 months of dating, Nikki discovered she was pregnant. In late 2015, she gave birth to their son Dylan. By the spring of 2016, Nikki and Doug were living together in Ledgeview, raising Dylan alongside Nikki's 2 older children. From the outside, they looked like a blended family trying to make it work. But beneath the surface, there were cracks, trust issues, arguments about Doug's attention to other women, the kind of tensions that can quietly poison a relationship. Still, Nikki did what she always did. She focused on her children. She was a devoted mother, the kind who would do anything for her kids. But she was also 31 years old with a 6-month-old baby, and she was tired. Tired of the sleepless nights, the endless responsibilities, the weight of it all. So when Doug suggested they get a babysitter and go out for a night on the town, Nikki said yes. It was May 20th, 2016, a Friday night. They hired Dallas Kennedy, a co-worker of Nikki's, to babysit little Dylan. The plan was simple: meet up with friends, catch a Steel Panther concert at a bar called the Watering Hole, blow off some steam. For Nikki, who had been breastfeeding and hadn't been drinking much alcohol, it was a chance to let loose, to feel like herself again, if only for one night. The Watering Hole was packed that Friday night. Steel Panther, a glam rock band known for their high-energy performances, was playing, and the crowd was in good spirits. Nikki and Doug arrived with friends, and at first everything seemed fine. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and for a few hours Nikki could forget about diapers and daycare and all the weight she'd been carrying. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere between Nikki and Doug shifted. Doug ran into some old friends from high school, people he hadn't seen in years. He got caught up in conversation, including with another woman, Nikki noticed, and she didn't like it. After the concert ended, the group decided to move to another bar downtown called the Sardine Can, just a short distance away on South Broadway. But Doug didn't join them. He stayed behind at the Watering Hole with his friend Greg Matthew, telling Nikki he'd catch up with her soon. That decision to split up, to stay behind, would prove to be fatal. At the Sardine Can, surveillance cameras captured Nikki arriving with her friends around 11:15 p.m. So at first she seemed to be having fun, dancing, laughing, talking. But as time passed and Doug still hadn't shown up, her mood changed. She kept checking her phone. She sent him text messages, angry messages. Messages accusing him of being abusive, controlling, unfaithful. The words got harsher with each passing minute. "You're cheating on me. You're a liar. You don't care about me." Doug responded, promising he'd be there soon, but his words rang hollow. Nikki called him. No answer. She called again. Nothing. Then around 11:30 p.m., one of her female friends tried calling Doug, and he picked up immediately. That was the breaking point for Nikki. He wouldn't answer her calls, but he'd answer someone else's. Surveillance footage shows Nikki on her phone at 11:40 p.m., visibly upset. Shortly after, she got up and stormed out of the bar. One of her friends, Aaron Glinsky, followed her outside, trying to convince her to come back or at least get a cab home. But Nikki was drunk and angry, and when Aaron tried to stop her, she got physical with him. Frustrated, Aaron gave up and walked back into the Sardine Can. The timestamp on the surveillance video reads 11:43 p.m. That was the last time Nikki's friends saw her alive. She was walking down South Broadway, her phone pressed to her ear, disappearing into the night. Security cameras captured her turning left at the top of the street, and then nothing. She vanished into the darkness of that May night. Back at the Watering Hole, Doug and Greg finally decided to leave. According to Doug's later statements to police, he tried to find Nikki at the Sardine Can, but she was already gone. He and Greg drove around Green Bay looking for her, calling, texting, even trying Snapchat. No response. Doug later said he figured Nikki had gone to a friend's house to crash for the night. So around 2:40 a.m., he and Greg returned to the house in Ledgeview. Dallas, the babysitter, was still awake. She later testified that Doug seemed concerned that he couldn't reach Nikki, but not overly worried. He showed Dallas some of the angry text messages Nikki had sent. They discussed where she might be. Then Doug and Greg smoked some marijuana and went to bed. The next morning, Doug woke up to feed Dylan. Nikki still wasn't home. Hours passed. No word from her. No calls. No texts. Doug later said he assumed she'd stayed with a friend and would come home when she was ready. But as the afternoon wore on, concern began to creep in. At 4:30 p.m. on Saturday, May 21st, Doug walked into the police station in Ledgeview and filed a missing person report. Police were polite but skeptical. Why had he waited so long? If his girlfriend, the mother of his infant son, hadn't come home from a night out, why hadn't he reported her missing sooner? Doug didn't have a good answer. He just said he thought she was with friends. But the police already knew something Doug didn't. Earlier that afternoon, around 2 p.m., a local farmer named Richard Vandehey had been checking his property off Hoffman Road in Bellevue, a rural area about 3 miles from Nikki and Doug's house. As he walked through a farm field, he noticed something odd near the tree line. At first he thought it was an animal, but as he got closer, his stomach dropped. It was a body. A woman's body. The 911 call came in at 2:03 p.m. Richard Vandehey's voice was shaky. "Oh God, we just found a human body. Officers arrived within minutes and secured the scene. The body was lying face down in the vegetation, partially hidden from the road. The woman was completely naked except for a pair of socks and a pink club wristband. The kind you get at a bar. Even from a distance, officers could see signs of trauma. There was what appeared to be a shoe print on her back. Her blonde hair was matted and dirty. When they turned the body over, the scene became even more horrific. The woman's face was so badly damaged that she was unrecognizable. Her features had been destroyed by repeated blows. Blood covered her skin. Even experienced officers struggled to maintain their composure. The investigation moved quickly. While some officers processed the scene, others began searching the surrounding area. About a mile away, on a highway ramp along Highway 72, an officer spotted something on the side of the road. Clothing. Women's clothing covered in dirt and blood. Nearby they found a purse containing a cell phone and an ID. The name on the ID was Nicole Vanderhayden. Back at the farm field, Detective Richard Lopp now coordinated with the Dane County Medical Examiner's office. Dr. Agnieszka Rogalska arrived to perform the initial examination. What she found was devastating. The victim had suffered catastrophic injuries. Strangulation marks around her neck, blunt force trauma to her head, a fractured skull bleeding around the brain, a hemorrhaged tongue. Her fingernails were broken and damaged, consistent with defensive wounds. She had fought for her life. 2 days later, a neighbor who lived across the street from Nikki and Doug's house called police. They'd found something disturbing in their yard, a charging cord and clumps of blonde hair with blood on them. There was also blood on their driveway, along with more hair, hairpins, and pieces of wire. The scene told a terrible story. Nikki had made it home. She had made it almost to safety, but someone had attacked her right there, just feet from her own front door. The formal autopsy revealed even more horrifying details. Dr. Rogalska counted 241 separate injuries on Nikki's body. 241, 20 abrasions, 8 contusions, 8 lacerations, injuries consistent with being strangled with a ligature, injuries consistent with being repeatedly slammed against the ground, injuries consistent with being kicked and stomped on, injuries to her wrists and ankles that suggested someone had tried to control her limbs, injuries to her genital area that indicated sexual assault. Dr. Rogalska determined that Nikki died from 2 causes, both of which were fatal in this environment: ligature strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. She couldn't determine which came first, which meant both were listed as causes of death. What she could say with certainty was that Nikki was alive when she was strangled, and she was alive when her head was struck. She had endured unimaginable pain in her final moments. A forensic dentist had to be brought in to positively identify the body. That's how badly her face had been destroyed. Nikki's family would later be told they couldn't view her body for a final goodbye. The damage was too severe. The killer hadn't just murdered her, he tried to erase who she was. Doug Dittree became the prime suspect almost immediately. He was the boyfriend. They'd been fighting. He'd stayed behind while she went to another bar. He'd waited hours before reporting her missing. When police searched the house, they found what looked like blood on the garage floor. And in Nikki's car, they found a pair of Air Jordan sneakers with what appeared to be blood streaks on them. Significant because the marks on Nikki's body suggested she'd been stomped on with shoes. On May 23rd, just 2 days after Nikki's body was found, police arrested Doug. They expected the DNA results to confirm their suspicions, and then they'd charge him with first-degree murder. He was held in the Brown County Jail while the investigation continued. But then something unexpected happened. The DNA results came back from the state crime lab. The blood on the garage floor wasn't human. It was probably from a pet. The blood in the car didn't match Nikki's. And most importantly, the DNA found on items recovered from the crime scene, particularly on one of Nikki's socks, belonged to an unidentified male. But it wasn't Doug Dittree. Investigators scrambled. Had they arrested the wrong person? They needed more evidence. Doug, meanwhile, had been cooperative throughout his detention. He'd given police access to his phone. He'd answered their questions, and he'd mentioned something that seemed trivial at the time. He'd been wearing his Fitbit that night. Nikki had actually bought it for him. A Fitbit is a fitness tracker worn on the wrist that monitors steps, heart rate, sleep patterns, and movement throughout the day. The data is stored in an app on the user's phone. Forensic analyst Tyler Bailing examined Doug's Fitbit data from the night of May 20th, going into the morning of May 21st. What he found was illuminating. The Fitbit showed that Doug arrived home at approximately 2:45 a.m. From that point until 6:10 a.m., when he got up to feed baby Dylan, the device had only registered 12 steps. 12. For the entire time period when Nikki was being brutally murdered, when her body was being transported to that farm field, when her clothes were being thrown from a moving vehicle, Doug's Fitbit showed he was sleeping. He hadn't moved. The data provided him with an alibi that was impossible to fake. 18 days after his arrest, Doug Dittrey was released from jail. He was never charged. But the damage to his reputation was done, and his relationship with Nikki's family was strained beyond repair. Years later, when Nikki's sister Heather testified at trial, she admitted she'd never been close to Doug, so much so that he'd had to message her on Facebook to tell her Nikki was missing because he didn't even have her phone number. With Doug cleared, investigators faced a terrifying reality. They had no suspect. The DNA belonged to someone unknown, someone with no apparent connection to Nikki or Doug or any of their friends. The case was on the verge of going cold. Sergeants Brian Slinger and Richard Lopnow worked the case obsessively. They re-interviewed witnesses. They pulled surveillance footage from every bridge in Green Bay, thinking maybe they could trace Nikki's route home. They submitted evidence to the crime lab 10 items at a time, the maximum they were allowed due to backlogs. And they waited. Then, 3 months after Nikki's murder, they got the call they'd been waiting for. The crime lab had finally managed to extract enough DNA from one of Nikki's socks to run it through the national database. They got a hit. The DNA belonged to a man named George Stephen Birch from Virginia. Slinger and Lopnow were ecstatic, but they were also puzzled. Virginia, who was George Birch, and what was he doing in Green Bay, Wisconsin? George Stephen Birch was a 40-year-old man with a troubled past. He'd grown up in Newport News, Virginia, and had spent most of his life there. But on March 1st, 2016, just 2.5 months before Nikki was murdered, Birch had moved to Green Bay. He was looking for a fresh start. A longtime friend had offered to help him get back on his feet, giving him a place to stay and helping him find work. The friend also loaned Birch a vehicle to use, a red Chevy Blazer. Nobody in Green Bay knew George Birch. He had no connection to Nikki, no connection to Doug, no connection to any of their friends. He was, as one journalist would later describe him, a complete mystery man, but his DNA was on Nikki's body, and that made him the prime suspect. As investigators dug into Birch's background, they discovered something interesting. On June 8, 2016, less than 3 weeks after Nikki's murder, Birch had been interviewed by the Green Bay Police Department about a completely unrelated matter. There had been a hit-and-run accident involving a stolen vehicle, and later a car fire. The vehicle in question was the red Chevy Blazer that Birch had been borrowing from his friend. During that interview, Birch claimed he couldn't have been involved in the hit-and-run because he'd been texting a woman from a bar that night. To prove his innocence, he volunteered to let police look at his phone. He signed a consent form giving the Green Bay Police or any assisting personnel permission to search his phone. Following department policy, they cloned his phone and returned it to him. Birch was cleared in the hit-and-run investigation, but the Green Bay Police still had all of his phone data. And when the Brown County Sheriff's Department came calling in August, asking about George Birch in connection with a murder investigation, that data became invaluable. Birch's phone contained a feature many people don't even realize they have: Google Dashboard. This tool doesn't just track cell tower pings like regular phone records. It collects GPS coordinates, tracks every Wi-Fi hotspot the phone encounters, and creates a detailed map of the phone's movements. It's frighteningly accurate. When investigators examined Birch's Google Dashboard data, from the night of May 20th into the early morning of May 21st, they found a damning digital trail. At 2:30 a.m., Birch was at a bar called Richard Cranium's, less than half a mile from the Sardine Can where Nikki had been drinking. At 3:01 a.m., his phone placed him at Nikki's house in Ledgeview. He stayed there for about an hour, until 3:52 a.m. Then his phone moved to the exact location of the farm field where Nikki's body was found, arriving just after 4:00 a.m. After that, the phone pinged along Highway 72, right where Nikki's clothes and belongings were discovered. Finally, at 4:22 a.m., the phone returned to Birch's residence. The digital evidence was overwhelming, but there was more. The morning after Nikki's murder, Birch went fishing with a friend. Photos from that trip, taken just hours after he'd allegedly committed one of the most brutal murders in Brown County history, showed Birch smiling and laughing. He showed no signs of guilt, no indication that anything was wrong. On September 7th, 2016, police arrested George Stephen Birch and charged him with first-degree intentional homicide. He was held without bail pending trial. The trial of George Stephen Birch began on February 19, 2018, nearly 2 years after Nikki's death. The Brown County Courthouse was packed with Nikki's family and friends, along with members of the media and curious members of the public. Everyone wanted to see justice served. The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: DNA evidence, cell phone data, and the Fitbit alibi. Assistant District Attorney David Lassie methodically walked the jury through the evidence. He showed them Dr. Rogalska's autopsy report, the photographs of Nikki's injuries, the 2041 separate wounds she'd suffered. He presented the DNA match from the sock. He displayed maps showing the GPS coordinates from Birch's phone, placing him at every critical location. He explained how Doug's Fitbit proved he'd been home sleeping while Nikki was being murdered. The prosecution's theory of the case was straightforward. Birch had been at Richard Cranium's bar that night, less than half a mile from the sardine can. At some point he encountered Nikki, either at a bar or on the street after she left the sardine can. He offered her a ride home in the red Chevy Blazer he'd been borrowing. Nikki, drunk and upset after her fight with Doug, accepted, but Birch had other intentions. He expected sex. When Nikki rejected his advances, he became enraged. He raped her. He beat her. He strangled her with a charging cord. The assault happened right across the street from her house, on the neighbor's driveway, where blood and hair were later found. Then he drove her body to the farm field and dumped it. On the way home, he threw her clothes and belongings out the window of the Blazer. The defense, led by attorney Lee Schuchard, had a different story to tell. And on February 28, 2018, day 8 of the trial, George Birch himself took the stand. Birch's testimony was shocking. He admitted he'd met Nikki that night. He admitted they'd gone to her house. But his version of events was wildly different from the prosecution's. According to Birch, he and Nikki had consensual sex in his truck, parked across the street from her house. But while they were engaged in this intimate moment, someone attacked them. Birch claimed he was knocked unconscious by a blow to the head, delivered with a gun. When he came to, he said Nikki was lying dead on the pavement, and Doug Detree was standing over him with a gun, demanding that Birch help him dispose of the body. Birch testified that Doug forced him at gunpoint to drive Nikki's body to the farm field. He claimed he had no choice. He was terrified. After dumping the body, Birch said he lunged at Doug, shoved him, and ran back to the Blazer before driving away. The defense attorney asked the critical question, George Birch, did you murder Nicole Vanderheyden? No, Birch replied. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. Assistant District Attorney David Lassie immediately attacked the credibility of Birch's story. Why would Doug ask a complete stranger to help dispose of his girlfriend's body? Why would Birch agree? If Birch was innocent, why didn't he go to the police? Why did he go fishing the next morning smiling and laughing? Why did his phone's GPS data match the timeline of the murder so perfectly? Birch struggled to answer. He claimed he was afraid of violating his probation by being in Wisconsin in the first place. He said he panicked. He said he didn't know what to do. But under Lassie's questioning, his story began to fall apart. The prosecution also presented testimony from the babysitter, Dallas Kennedy, who described Doug's behavior when he returned home that night. He'd seemed concerned, but not panicked. He'd shown her the angry text messages from Nikki. There was nothing to suggest he'd just committed a murder. And of course there was the Fitbit data. 12 steps in over 3 hours. Doug had been sleeping. Dr. Rogalska's testimony was particularly damning for the defense. She testified that the injuries to Nikki's body, the strangulation marks, the blunt force trauma, the defensive wounds, were all consistent with a violent sexual assault, not with consensual sex, followed by an attack by someone else. She also noted that many of the injuries showed vital reactions, meaning Nikki's heart was still beating when they were inflicted. She had been alive, conscious, and fighting for her life. One of Birch's friends testified that Birch had seemed nervous in the days after the murder, constantly checking his phone for news about the investigation. Another witness testified about seeing someone matching Birch's description in the area that night. The defense tried to cast doubt on the reliability of the technology. They questioned whether the Fitbit data was accurate. They suggested the GPS coordinates might be imprecise. They argued that the jury shouldn't convict based on untested technology, but the evidence was overwhelming. On March 1, 2018, after 9 days of testimony, closing arguments were delivered. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. Nikki's family wept. Doug Dutree, who'd been in the courtroom throughout the trial, embraced his mother. After months of being suspected, investigated, and judged, he was finally exonerated in the eyes of the public. The real killer had been caught. On May 4, 2018, George Stephen Birch was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before the sentence was handed down, Nikki's family was given the opportunity to address the court. Her mother, Vicky, spoke through tears about the daughter she'd lost. "I'm waiting for her to come walking through my door again," she said. "I miss her the most. I miss her." Her brother Brandon spoke about the picture he kept of him and Nikki as children, a photo he looked at every night. Nikki's sister Heather described the void left in their family. And Nikki's children, Michaela, Tyler, and little Dylan, would grow up without their mother. Judge John Zakowski delivered the sentence with grave solemnity. He called the murder of Nicole Vanderhayden the most brutal murder that has ever been committed by one person in the history of Brown County. He noted the severity of her injuries, the premeditation involved, and the callousness Birch displayed in the hours and days after the murder. Birch showed no emotion as the sentence was read. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs and transported to the Wisconsin Secure Program facility, a maximum security prison, where he remains today. But the legal battle wasn't over. Birch appealed his conviction, arguing that his Fourth Amendment rights had been violated when police used data from his cell phone. He claimed that when he consented to the phone search during the hit-and-run investigation, he'd only meant for them to look at his text messages, not to clone his entire phone. He argued that using that data in a murder investigation exceeded the scope of his consent. The case went all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which heard arguments in December 2020. The defense also challenged the admissibility of the Fitbit data, arguing that without expert testimony explaining how the device worked, the jury couldn't properly evaluate its reliability. On June 30th, 2021, the Wisconsin Supreme Court issued its ruling in a 4-3 decision. The majority found that police had not violated Birch's rights. The consent form he'd signed had explicitly given permission to Green Bay Police or any assisting personnel to search his phone. The Brown County Sheriff's Department qualified as assisting personnel. The court also ruled that the Fitbit data was admissible without expert testimony because the technology was simple enough for a jury to understand on their own. Justice Ann Walsh. Bradley wrote a strong dissent, arguing that this was a groundbreaking question and the first appellate decision in the country to allow Fitbit evidence without expert testimony. She worried about the implications for future cases, but the majority opinion stood. Birch's conviction was upheld. The murder of Nicole Vanderhayden became a landmark case, not just in Brown County, but across the nation. It was featured on multiple true crime television shows, including NBC's Dateline, CBS's 48 Hours, and Oxygen's An Unexpected Killer. Correspondent Andrea Canning called it one of the most horrific cases she'd ever covered. The case highlighted the growing role of technology in criminal investigations. The Fitbit data that exonerated Doug Dutree was revolutionary. The Google dashboard data that placed Birch at the crime scene was unprecedented in its detail. Legal scholars began debating the implications. How much can law enforcement access from our devices? What constitutes consent? What level of expertise is needed to evaluate digital evidence? For the Green Bay community, Nikki's murder shattered the sense of safety that had defined the area. Green Bay was supposed to be a place where mothers don't go missing, where bodies aren't found in farm fields. But Nikki's death proved that violence can happen anywhere, to anyone. For Nikki's family, the pain never fades. Her mother, Vicky, speaks at events about violence against women, keeping her daughter's memory alive. Her children are being raised by their respective fathers, growing up with photographs and stories of the mother they barely knew. Little Dylan was only 6 months old when his mother was murdered. He'll never remember her voice, her smile, the way she him. Doug Dittrey has largely stayed out of the public eye, focusing on raising Dylan. The experience of being arrested, jailed, and suspected of murdering his girlfriend left scars that may never heal. Even after being exonerated, some people still wondered. The shadow of suspicion is hard to escape. And George Stephen Birch sits in a maximum security prison, serving life without parole. He maintains his innocence to this day, insisting that Doug Dittrey is the real killer. But the evidence, the DNA, the GPS data, the timeline, the injuries tells a different story. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Nicole Vanderhayden, not about her brutal death, but about her life. Think about the substitute teacher who loved science and connected with students. Think about the mother who adored her 3 children. Think about the daughter, the sister, the friend. Think about the 31-year-old woman who just wanted one night out, one night to feel like herself again. Nikki's story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. George Birch was a stranger, someone Nikki had never met before that night. She probably thought she was accepting a ride home from someone harmless. She probably thought she'd be safe. But Nikki's story is also a reminder that justice, while slow, can prevail. Modern technology, the very devices we carry in our pockets every day, helped catch a killer and exonerate an innocent man. The evidence didn't lie. The truth emerged. In a small cemetery in Wisconsin, there's a gravestone with Nicole Vanderhayden's name on it. Flowers are left there regularly by family members who haven't forgotten, who will never forget. Because Nikki wasn't just a victim. She was a person, a whole life, a future that was stolen. And somewhere in that maximum security prison, George Birch knows what he did. Whether he admits it or not, whether he feels remorse or not, the truth is known. The night is quiet now. Let your mind rest. Let the weight of the story settle. And remember, in the darkness, there are those who seek to do harm. But there are also those who seek justice, who work tirelessly to uncover the truth, who refuse to let evil win. Nicole Vanderhayden's case is closed. Her killer is behind bars. And while nothing can bring her back, while nothing can heal the wounds left on her family, there is some measure of peace in knowing the truth. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, we think about the choices we make, the text messages we send, the people we trust, the moments that seem inconsequential at the time, but change everything. This is the story of Jessica O'Grady, a 19-year-old college student from Omaha, Nebraska, whose life ended on a spring night in 2006, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt her family for years to come. This case is unusual, troubling, and raises questions about truth, evidence, and the spaces between what we know and what we can prove. It's a story without closure, where a young woman's body has never been found, yet justice in its own complicated way was still served. Let me take you back to May 2006, to a city in the heart of America's Midwest, where a university student was building her future, one shift at a time. Jessica Jo O'Grady was tall, with brown hair and hazel eyes, and a palm tree tattooed on her lower back, a small rebellion perhaps, or simply a reminder of warmer places. She was in her sophomore year at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, studying social studies with dreams of becoming a teacher. Those who knew her said she had recently discovered her passion for early childhood education while working at a daycare. She lit up around children, they said. She had found her calling. To pay her way through school, Jessica worked as a waitress at a steakhouse in West Omaha. It was the kind of job that teaches you about people, how they treat you when you bring them the wrong order, how they tip, what they say when they think you're not listening. Jessica was good at it. She was reliable, showing up for every shift, always on time. Her coworkers liked her. Her managers trusted her. She lived in an apartment with 2 roommates, Holly Stum and Tracy Christensen. Three young women had that easy friendship that develops when you're navigating adulthood together. Sharing groceries, staying up too late talking, covering for each other's mistakes. Jessica was close with her family too, especially her aunt Shauna Stanzel. She'd lived with Shauna for a time as a child, and the bond between them remained strong. Jessica had a cat. This detail matters because of what comes later, because when someone disappears, we look at what they left behind. And Jessica loved that cat. In the spring of 2006, Jessica's life seemed full of possibility. She was young, working toward a degree, figuring out who she wanted to be. She had friends at the restaurant where she worked, including a young man named Christopher Edwards. He was a student at the university too. They'd been flirting, getting to know each other. Seemed harmless, natural, the way these things often begin. It was a Wednesday night. Jessica was at her apartment with her roommates and some friends. They were having one of those casual gatherings that fill the spaces between classes and work. Music playing, conversation flowing. Nothing special, nothing memorable. Just a normal evening. Then around 11:30, Jessica's phone buzzed. A text message. Her demeanor changed. She told her friends she had to go. Chris had messaged her and wanted her to come over. Her friends later remembered this moment, how she seemed eager to leave, how she gathered her things quickly. She got into her gray Hyundai Accent and drove into the night. At 11:48 p.m., she made a phone call from her cell. The person on the other end was Christopher Edwards. She told him she was on her way to his house near 120th and Blondo Streets on the western edge of Omaha. It was the last time anyone heard from Jessica O'Grady. The next day, Thursday, May 11th, Jessica didn't show up for work at the steakhouse. This was unusual. Jessica was reliable. She didn't miss shifts. When her manager tried to reach her, there was no answer. Her friends called. Her aunt called. Nothing. Silence. By Friday, worry had turned to alarm. Jessica's family went to the police. Something was wrong. Jessica wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't leave her cat without care. She wouldn't abandon her paycheck, which sat uncashed at the restaurant. She wouldn't stop answering her phone, stop texting her friends, stop calling her family. The police took the report, but in those first days there were more questions than answers. Young people sometimes disappear for a day or two. Maybe she'd gone somewhere spontaneously. Maybe there was a simple explanation. But as the hours passed, and Jessica's phone remained silent and her apartment stayed empty, it became clear this was not a spontaneous trip. This was something else. On Tuesday, May 16th, 6 days after Jessica vanished, the case landed on the desk of Detective Eric Nordby of the Omaha Police Department. Nordby was a veteran officer with 19 years at OPD and 8 more years with the Fremont Police Department before that. He was also an Army Reserve soldier, a man shaped by discipline and duty. Missing persons cases weren't his primary focus. But when he read Jessica's file, something caught his attention. Here was a 19-year-old woman who had regular contact with multiple people, family, friends, coworkers, her roommates. And on May 10th, all of that contact stopped. Abruptly, completely, her phone went silent. Her bank account untouched. Her cat left alone. Nordby knew what this pattern meant. He knew that when someone's entire life comes to a sudden halt, when all their habits and connections sever at once, it usually means something terrible has happened. He began with the basics. Jessica's phone records, her last known location, the people she'd been in contact with, and one name kept appearing, Christopher Edwards, the co-worker she'd been seeing, the young man whose house she'd driven to on the night of May 10th. Edwards hadn't been interviewed yet. Nordby needed to talk to him. He found Edwards and brought him to police headquarters. It was a lengthy interview, one of those conversations where every word matters, where pauses speak as loudly as answers. Edwards seemed cooperative at first. Nordby later recalled, he seemed like he wanted to help, but as the interview progressed, Nordby noticed something. Edwards was evasive. His story didn't quite make sense. Edwards claimed that he and Jessica had decided not to meet on the night of May 10th. He said she never came to his house. He said that on May 11th he'd sent her a text asking why she didn't show up, but Nordby had Jessica's phone records. He knew the truth. After May 10th, Edwards had sent exactly one text to Jessica. Just one. And when she didn't respond, he didn't try again. He didn't call her. He didn't call her parents. He didn't call the police. He simply stopped trying to contact her. For Nordby, this raised a red flag. If your girlfriend doesn't show up, doesn't respond to your text, and then disappears completely, wouldn't you be worried? Wouldn't you try harder to find her? Edwards also claimed that Jessica had visited his house on the night of May 9th, the day before she disappeared. But when Nordby spoke with Jessica's family and friends, this turned out to be false. Jessica hadn't been at Edwards' house on May 9th. Why would Edwards lie about when Jessica had last been at his house? Nordby asked Edwards if he could search his residence. Edwards, still appearing cooperative, agreed. He lived in his aunt's house in a basement bedroom, a modest room in a modest home in suburban Omaha. Nordby walked down to the basement. He began looking around, and then he saw it. Specks of blood, small spots, the kind you might miss if you weren't looking carefully. He looked closer, there was more blood. Much more, on the walls. On the mattress. Large amounts of it. Nordby knew, standing in that basement bedroom, that Jessica O'Grady had not survived whatever had happened here. A search warrant was obtained. What started as a consent search became a full-scale investigation. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office took jurisdiction, and their crime scene investigation unit, led by CSI Director David Kofit, descended on the house near 1111th and Blondo Streets. What they found was damning. Jessica's blood was everywhere. In Christopher Edwards' bedroom, it soaked the mattress so thoroughly that experts would later testify she could not have survived the loss of blood. It streaked the ceiling. It was on the headboard, the comforter, the alarm clock, a clothes basket, the walls. Someone had tried to clean it up. Someone had tried to hide what happened. Blood stains on the walls had been covered with whiteout, the kind you use to correct mistakes on paper. White shoe polish, too. A hasty, desperate attempt to conceal the evidence. Investigators obtained surveillance footage from a Walgreens store at 13 2nd Street and West Maple Road. The footage showed Christopher Edwards shopping late on the night of May 10th. The timestamp just hours after Jessica's last phone call. Edwards was buying whiteout and cleaning supplies. The receipt was found in his room, dated May 11th. But that wasn't all. In Edwards' closet, investigators found an 18-inch Bangkok battle sword. A decorative weapon, the kind collectors keep as a curiosity. Jessica's blood was on the blade. Her blood was also found on another sword in the home, on hedge clippers and on a shovel. And in the trunk of Edwards' car, his gray Honda, investigators found more of Jessica's blood. On the rubber gasket along the edge of the trunk. On the metal surface inside. The implication was clear. Jessica's body had been placed in that trunk. It had been transported somewhere. But where? Where was Jessica? Despite extensive searches, rural areas, creeks, fields, no trace of Jessica O'Grady's body was ever found. As investigators dug deeper into Christopher Edwards' life, a motive began to emerge. Edwards hadn't just been seeing Jessica. He'd been involved with another woman, Carrie Peterson. And in January 2006, 4 months before Jessica disappeared, Carrie had become pregnant with Edwards' child. Jessica's friends later told police that she'd been concerned she might be pregnant too. That's why she'd wanted to talk to Edwards on May 10th. She wanted to discuss it with him. According to the testimony that would later emerge at trial, Jessica had told Carrie's mother, Teresa Peterson, on May 8th, just 2 days before she vanished, that she thought she was pregnant. She believed Christopher Edwards was the father, but there was complexity here, questions that would never be fully answered. Edwards' defense would later claim that Jessica had been involved with another man, Christopher McClanathan, and that she'd had a miscarriage after taking birth control pills. They wanted to suggest that Jessica wasn't pregnant at all, that the whole motive was based on a misunderstanding. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Christopher Edwards was seeing 2 women. Both had become pregnant by him. When Jessica came to his house on May 10th to talk about her pregnancy, he panicked. Perhaps he didn't want the complication. Perhaps he felt trapped. Perhaps it was a moment of rage. Whatever the reason, on that night in May, in a basement bedroom in Omaha, Nebraska, Christopher Edwards killed Jessica O'Grady. He killed her with violence, so extreme that her blood painted the room, and then methodically, He cleaned up as best he could, bought supplies to cover the evidence, and disposed of her body somewhere it would never be found. In June 2006, Christopher Edwards was arrested and charged with Jessica O'Grady's murder. He turned himself in to face the charges. From the beginning, and to this day, Edwards has maintained his innocence. He says he didn't kill Jessica. He says he doesn't know what happened to her. Before the trial, prosecutors offered Edwards a deal: plead guilty to manslaughter and lead them to Jessica's body. The sentence would be lighter. The family would have closure. It seemed like a reasonable offer, the kind that might tempt a guilty man who wanted to minimize his punishments. Edwards refused. The trial began in March 2007. It was unprecedented in Nebraska. A murder trial without a body, without a confession, without direct evidence of death. The prosecution would have to prove, using circumstantial evidence alone, that Jessica O'Grady was dead and that Christopher Edwards had killed her. The defense argued that without a body, you couldn't prove death. They proposed a jury instruction defining death in medical terms: the irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or the irreversible cessation of all brain functions. They argued that without medical confirmation of death, there was no murder. The judge rejected this instruction. The law, he said, was clear. Circumstantial evidence could be sufficient to prove death. The fact that a murderer successfully disposes of a victim's body doesn't entitle him to acquittal. Society, the judge noted, has no reward for that particular form of success. The prosecution built their case on the blood evidence. The mountain of it, the scientific certainty of DNA analysis. Expert after expert testified that the blood in Edwards' bedroom belonged to Jessica O'Grady. They testified about the quantity of blood loss, how much a human body contains, how much can be lost before death becomes inevitable. The blood on the mattress alone, they said, represented a loss Jessica could not have survived. They presented the timeline: Jessica's last phone call, Edwards' purchase of cleaning supplies, his lies about when she'd last visited, his failure to report her missing or even to show concern when she vanished. They showed the surveillance footage, the receipts, the attempted cover-up with whiteout and shoe polish, and they presented the weapons. The Bangkok battle sword, with Jessica's blood on the blade, suggesting the violence of her final moments. The defense called a witness, a woman who claimed to have had Edwards' child, who said she'd even slept in his bedroom after Jessica disappeared and noticed nothing unusual, nothing alarming. They tried to cast doubt on the pregnancy motive, suggesting Jessica might not have been pregnant at all, might have miscarried, might have been involved with someone else. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming. After deliberating, the jury reached a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder and use of a deadly weapon. In April 2007, a Douglas County District Judge sentenced Christopher Edwards to 100 years to life in prison. It was the only case in Nebraska's history where someone had been convicted of murder without finding the victim's body or obtaining a confession. The story, however, didn't end there, because in the years following Edwards' conviction, a scandal erupted that would shake Nebraska's justice system and cast a shadow over every case David Kofod had touched. David Kofod, you'll remember, was the CSI director who'd led the investigation of Edwards' house, who'd processed the crime scene, who'd found Jessica's blood in the trunk of Edwards' car. In 2010, Kofod was convicted of planting evidence in a different murder case, the killings of Wayne and Charmaine Stock in Saunders County. The case had been botched from the start, with coerced confessions and fabricated evidence. Kofod had planted a speck of blood in a vehicle to link two innocent men to the murders. He served 2 years in prison for evidence tampering. When news of Kofod's conviction broke, Edwards' attorneys saw an opportunity. They filed appeals, arguing that if Kofod had planted evidence in one case, he might have planted evidence in Edwards' case too. They pointed to the blood found in the trunk of Edwards' car, discovered by Kofod himself. They noted that Edwards' trial attorney, Steve Leffler, had represented Kofod during his evidence tampering case. A potential conflict of interest. The appeals process dragged on for years. The Nebraska Supreme Court reviewed the case in 2009 and upheld the conviction. Another appeal in 2012 led to a new hearing. In 2015, District Court Judge Jerry Russell Dare, the same judge who'd presided over the original trial, evaluated the claims of fabricated evidence and ruled that suspicions about Kofod did not warrant a new trial. The judge noted something crucial. even before Kofod arrived at the scene. Other investigators had found Jessica's blood in the bedroom, on the sword on the pruning shears, the blood-soaked mattress, the blood on the ceiling, the blood on the walls. This evidence existed independently of anything Kofod had done. The sheer volume of evidence, the judge said, showed no signs of tampering. Most importantly, the judge wrote, "There is no evidence in the entire record that establishes, much less even hints, that the state knowingly used false evidence to secure defendant's conviction." The conviction stood. Edwards remains in prison today. In October 2017, more than 11 years after Jessica disappeared, investigators returned to the Edwards family home. A cadaver dog had indicated something. Ground-penetrating radar showed what appeared to be a mass beneath a concrete patio. Douglas County Sheriff Tim Dunning held a press conference, expressing hope that Jessica's remains, or at least evidence of what had happened to her, would finally be found. Investigators worked through the night, breaking up a 15 by 15-foot section of concrete, carefully sifting through the soil beneath like archaeologists at a dig site. They dug about a foot into the earth before suspending the search for the night. The search resumed the next morning. They dug deeper, 16 to 18 inches. Sheriff Dunning had said, was where they expected to find something. But there was nothing there. No remains. No evidence. Just earth and concrete and the echoes of hope unfulfilled. The family had been waiting. Jessica's aunt, Shauna Stanzel, told reporters they tried to keep busy, tried not to get their hopes up too much, but couldn't help hoping. They wanted closure. They wanted to bring Jessica home. They wanted to give her a proper burial. The one thing we all do for the people we love, Shauna said. Christopher Edwards has never led investigators to Jessica's body. He's never admitted his guilt. He's never given the family the one thing they need most. Answers about where their daughter, their niece, their friend is resting. So, what do we make of this case? What truths can we extract from the blood and the silence and the years of searching? There is no physical body, but there is proof of death, liters of blood. Enough that no human could survive its loss. There is no confession, but there is a timeline that cannot be explained away. There is reasonable doubt about some pieces of evidence given Kofod's later conviction, but there is a mountain of evidence that stands independent of any one investigator's work. The law says that circumstantial evidence can be enough to convict. The law says that successfully hiding a body doesn't earn you freedom. And in this case, the law spoke clearly. Christopher Edwards murdered Jessica O'Grady. But for Jessica's family, the legal resolution feels incomplete. They know she's dead. They've accepted that painful truth, but they don't know where she is. They can't visit a grave. They can't have a funeral that brings final closure. They live with what Shauna Stanzel called the one missing piece. The one thing we all do for the people we love. Years after the conviction, Shauna spoke about Edwards directly, saying what many family members must feel in cases like this. You've lost your appeals. You don't even need to admit your guilt. Just tell us where she is. It's time, she said. It's time to let Jessica come home. This case asks us to consider difficult questions about justice, truth, and the nature of evidence. Can someone be guilty of murder if the victim's body is never found? The law says yes. Common sense says yes. The blood evidence, the timeline, the behavior, it all points in one direction. But there's something unsettling about a case without a body, isn't there? Something that feels unfinished. We want closure not just for the legal system, but for ourselves, for our understanding of what happened. We want to know the full story, and without Jessica's body, there are chapters that will never be written. Detective Eric Nordby, reflecting on the case years later, spoke about what drove him during those crucial early days of the investigation. He'd worked 33 hours straight at one point, pushing himself beyond normal limits. Most people don't have that drive, he said, but military people understand it. He spoke about the Army values he carried into his civilian work, especially selfless service. He spoke about the team that made the conviction possible, the Omaha Police Department, the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, the prosecutors, the crime lab technicians. This is the only case in Nebraska where somebody's been prosecuted and convicted without a body or without a confession. Norby said, "It set a precedent. It showed that justice could still be served even when a killer successfully hides his victim. But for Jessica's family, precedent and legal victories matter less than the simple human need to know where their loved one rests." They've come to terms with her death, Shauna Stanzel has said, but they still need answers. They still hold out hope that someday someone will come forward, that Christopher Edwards or someone who knows something will finally break the silence. Because somewhere, in a place only one person knows, Jessica O'Grady is waiting to be found. She's waiting to come home. On May 10th, 2006, a 19-year-old college student drove through the night to meet someone she trusted. She had her whole life ahead of her. Dreams of teaching, of working with children, of building something meaningful. She never made it home. The law has spoken. Justice, in its formal sense, has been served. But for the people who love Jessica, true justice would mean knowing where she is. It would mean being able to visit her grave, to leave flowers, to say goodbye properly. Maybe someday that will happen. Maybe someday the silence will break. Until then, her family waits, and Jessica O'Grady remains one of those heartbreaking cases where we know what happened, we know who's responsible, but we cannot bring the story to its final chapter. Her memory lives on in the people who loved her, in the case that changed Nebraska law, and in the investigators who worked tirelessly to bring her killer to justice. She was 19 years old. She was studying to be a teacher. She loved children. She had a palm tree tattoo and a cat she adored. She deserves to be remembered as more than a victim, more than evidence, more than a case file. She was Jessica, and she mattered. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. February in Athens, Georgia usually brings that peculiar southern chill. The kind where the morning air bites just enough to make you pull your jacket a little tighter, but not so cold that it stops the runners, the joggers, the students who crisscross the University of Georgia campus with their AirPods in, and their minds elsewhere. It's the kind of weather that makes you feel alive when you're moving, your breath visible in small clouds as you pound the pavement. On the morning of February 22nd, 2024, Laken Hope Riley woke up in her apartment off campus, ready for what seemed like an ordinary Thursday. She was 22 years old, a nursing student at Augusta University's Athens campus, living her dream of helping others. Her roommates would later describe her as someone who was never late, never off schedule, the kind of person who had her life together, who made birthday surprises for her friends, even when she had early morning clinical rotations, who sent good morning texts to her younger sister every single day. That morning around 8 o'clock, Laken sat in her apartment with her iPad, taking notes, doing homework, watching Netflix. She chatted with her roommate, Connolly Huth, about their weekend plans. The conversation was light, comfortable, the kind of talk that happens between friends, who live together, who know each other's rhythms and routines. At about 8:45, Connolly left for class. It would be the last time she would ever see Laken alive. Laken Riley was a runner. Not just someone who occasionally jogged, but someone who found peace in the rhythm of her feet hitting the ground, who used those solitary miles to think, to pray, to center herself. She often ran with her roommates on the trails at the University of Georgia's Oconee Forest Park, near Lake Herrick. They'd end their runs at the dock by the lake, playing music, talking, simply being present with each other. That morning, Laken decided to run alone. She sent her mother a text at 8:55. "Good morning, about to go for a run, if you're free to talk." It was routine for them. Her mother, Allison Phillips, often spoke with her daughter during her runs. At 9:03, Laken called her mom. No answer. No matter, she'd call back. The Ring camera at her apartment captured her leaving, black jacket, black leggings, white sneakers, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She had her iPhone, her Garmin smartwatch, her noise-canceling AirPods, everything she needed for a morning run, everything she thought would keep her safe. Around 9:05, a trail camera on the University of Georgia campus spotted her jogging toward the intramural fields. She was alone, moving with purpose, just another student getting in some exercise before the day really began. At 9:06, her mother tried calling back. The phone rang, and rang. Laken didn't answer. What happened in the next 25 minutes would be reconstructed later, through technology, through the data from Laken's Garmin watch and iPhone, through campus security cameras, through forensic evidence that would tell a story her voice could not. Around 9:10 in the morning, something happened that stopped Lakin's run. The data from her smartwatch showed an abrupt change. Her heart rate, which had been elevated from running, began to spike in a different way. At 9:11, Lakin activated her phone's SOS function. She called 911. Imagine that moment. You're running along a trail you've run dozens of times before. The woods are quiet except for the sound of your breathing, the crunch of leaves under your feet, maybe a bird calling somewhere in the trees. And then you realize you're not alone. Someone is there, someone who shouldn't be there, someone whose intentions become clear in an instant. The 911 call connected to Athens Clarke County Police Department, but Lakin couldn't speak. The call disconnected at 9:12. Dispatchers tried calling back. No answer, just silence on the other end. The data from Lakin's smartwatch painted a picture of what happened next. Her heart rate continued to fluctuate, dropping, spiking, dropping again. The watch showed movement, but not the steady rhythm of running. This was something else. This was a struggle. For several minutes, Lakin Riley fought. She fought with everything she had. During that fight, during those desperate moments when she was trying to survive, she gathered evidence beneath her fingernails. DNA that would later prove crucial. Her phone moved about 65 feet from the trail, deeper into the woods. At 9:28, Lakin's smartwatch recorded one final piece of data. Her heart stopped beating. 25 minutes after she'd left her apartment for a morning run, 22-year-old Lakin Riley was dead. The cause would later be determined as a combination of blunt force trauma to the head and asphyxiation. 8 injuries to the left side of her skull. A complex skull fracture back at Lakin's apartment. Time continued to pass. 9:30. 10 o'clock. 10:30. Lakin's mother kept trying to call. At 9:58, she sent a text. You're making me nervous not answering while you're out running. Are you okay? 11:04. Another call from her mother. 11:12. Another call. By now, Lakin's roommates were starting to worry too. Lakin was never late. She was never out of touch for this long. Something was wrong. One of her roommates opened the Find My app on her phone. All of Lakin's roommates shared their locations with each other. A safety measure. A way to keep tabs on one another in a world that often felt dangerous for young women. The app showed Lakin's initials. LR, frozen in place. Her last known location was the University of Georgia Trail near Lake Herrick. She hadn't moved in hours. At 11:30 that morning, 2 of Lakin's roommates, Lily Steiner and Sophia Magana, went searching for her on the trail. They followed the path she usually took, calling her name, looking for any sign of her. Cell phone service was spotty in the wooded area, making their search more difficult. They found something near the trail, a single AirPod. It was Lakin's. With no cell service in the woods, they returned to their apartment and called the University of Georgia police at 12:05. They reported Lakin missing. She'd gone for a run that morning and never came back. University of Georgia Police Sergeant Kenneth Maxwell responded to the call. He began searching the wooded area near the trail. At 12:38 that afternoon, he found her. Lakin's body was about 65 feet from the trail, partially hidden in the woods. Her shirt had been pulled up. It looked, as Maxwell would later testify, as if someone had tried to remove it or had used it to drag her. He gasped. The sound was caught on his body camera, and immediately began performing CPR, though it was far too late. This was the first homicide on the University of Georgia campus in over 2 decades. In over 40 years, some would say, it was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be different. As soon as Lakin's body was discovered, the campus transformed. Police from multiple agencies, UGA Police, Athens Clarke County, Georgia State Patrol, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, descended on the area. They closed off the trails. They began collecting evidence, and they began reviewing camera footage. The trail cameras had captured more than just Lakin. That morning, around 7:45, about an hour before Lakin began her run, the cameras had recorded a man dressed in dark clothing, wearing what appeared to be a black Adidas cap, lurking near the intramural fields. He wasn't dressed for exercise. He was just there, watching, waiting. Investigators traced a path through the campus security footage. That same figure appeared on cameras near an apartment building, looking through windows, Later, that behavior would add another charge to the growing list. Peeping Tom. The figure seemed to be, as prosecutors would later describe it, hunting for females on campus that morning. By Friday morning, February 23rd, police had a suspect in mind. They went to an apartment complex called Cielo Azelic on South Millage Avenue, less than half a mile from where Lekin's body had been found. The complex was connected to the university's trails by a network of paths. Paved walkways that led to dirt paths that led to train tracks that led to more dirt paths that led directly to the intramural fields where Lekin had been running. In one of those apartments lived 5 people, 3 brothers from Venezuela and 2 others. The apartment was small, cramped, just 2 rooms with a tiny stove, piles of clothes everywhere. The 3 brothers were Jose Antonio Ibarra, Diego Ibarra, and Argenis Ibarra. They had all entered the United States illegally at different times, all seeking some version of a better life. On Friday afternoon, officers searched the apartment complex. They set up a command center, brought in portable lights and bathrooms. A drone buzzed overhead. They knocked on every door, spoke to every resident, and they found something crucial. Surveillance footage showing a man disposing of items in a dumpster near the apartments at 9:44 on Thursday morning, just 16 minutes after Lekin's heart had stopped beating. An Athens Clark County police officer named Zachary Davis retrieved what had been thrown away, a jacket, dark and bloodied, and disposable gloves. When forensic analysts examined that jacket, they found hairs that matched Lekin Riley's distinct characteristics. They found DNA, both Lekin's and someone else's. Police brought in Jose Antonio Ibarra for questioning. His roommate had identified him as the person in the surveillance footage, disposing of the jacket. During questioning, officers noticed his knuckles were red. He had scratches on his arms. When they asked him about February 22nd, his answers were vague, contradictory. That Friday evening, Jose Antonio Ibarra was arrested and charged with murder. He was 26 years old. To understand what happened that February morning, you have to understand Jose Ibarra's journey to Athens, Georgia. He was from Venezuela, a country that by 2024 was in the midst of a massive humanitarian crisis. Millions of Venezuelans had fled economic collapse, political repression, violence, and hunger. They traveled north, often on foot, through Colombia, Central America, and Mexico, hoping to reach the United States. In September 2022, Jose Ibarra crossed the border near El Paso, Texas, illegally. He was arrested by immigration officials, processed, and then, as was common practice under the parole system, released into the United States pending further adjudication of his case. He was given a future court date and sent on his way. He headed to New York City, where he lived in his car while his wife and mother-in-law stayed in a Queens hotel that had been converted to a migrant shelter. In New York, Ibarra had a brush with the law. In August 2023, he was arrested for driving a motorized scooter without a license and without a helmet while carrying a 5-year-old child. He was charged with reckless endangerment of a child and acting in a manner injurious to a child. He bonded out and was never prosecuted. The charges were eventually dismissed. By October 2023, Ibarra had moved to Georgia. His brother Diego had been encouraging him and their friend Razbeli Flores Bello to come to Athens. Diego told them there were jobs available, opportunities they wouldn't find in New York. So Jose and Razbeli took what they called a humanitarian flight to Georgia and moved into the cramped apartment on South Millage Avenue with Diego, Argenis, and one other person. In Athens, the siblings tried to build a life. Razbeli worked at a fast food restaurant. Jose and Argenis got jobs at a local eatery. Diego presented a fake green card and briefly worked as a dishwasher at Bolton Dining Hall on the UGA campus. He was often late to his shifts, and when the university discovered his immigration status, he was fired immediately without ever receiving a paycheck. In October 2023, Jose and his brother were arrested by Athens police for theft. They'd allegedly been caught with stolen merchandise from a local Walmart. They were released. In December, a bench warrant was issued for Jose after he failed to appear in court for the shoplifting case. But he was never picked up on that warrant. He continued living in the apartment, kept to himself, mostly according to neighbors. One resident described the brothers as friendly but a little flamboyant and loud. Immigration and Customs Enforcement later revealed they had missed an opportunity to issue a detainer for Ibarra before he was released by New York officials. This detail would become a lightning rod in the national debate about immigration policy. But all of that, the political debate, The finger-pointing, the legislative battles came later. On February 22nd, Jose Ibarra woke up in his apartment, put on dark clothing and a black Adidas cap, took a selfie that he posted to Snapchat, and walked out into the cold morning. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against Jose Ibarra became, in the words of prosecutors, overwhelming. Let's walk through what they found. First, there was the DNA evidence. Ashley Hinkle, a crime lab scientist with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, testified that DNA found beneath Lakin's right fingernails matched Jose Ibarra. The probability of that DNA belonging to anyone else, 1 in 10 Billy Ibarra's 2 brothers, who lived with him, were excluded as matches. Then there was the jacket and gloves found in the dumpster. DNA from both Lakin and Ibarra was found on the jacket. The bloodstains were visible even to the naked eye. There was the fingerprint evidence. A left thumbprint on Lakin's iPhone matched Jose Ibarra's thumb. The defense would argue he was supposedly wearing gloves, but that thumbprint was there, clear as day. There was the surveillance footage cameras tracking the figure in dark clothing throughout the morning, lurking around buildings, peering into windows, and ultimately in the vicinity of the trail where Lakin was running. There was the cell phone data. An FBI specialist named James Burney testified that electronic location data placed Riley and Ibarra in the same wooded area at the time of her death. GPS coordinates from Lakin's phone and smartwatch confirmed her precise location where officers found her body. Pings between Ibarra's phone and cell towers suggested he was in those woods too. At exactly the same time, there was the testimony of Ibarra's roommate, Rosbelly Flores Bello, who identified him in the surveillance footage disposing of the jacket. There was even a jail phone call from May, months after Ibarra's arrest. He called his wife Leyling Franco from jail. An FBI translator listened to the conversation in Spanish and testified about what was said. According to the translator, Ibarra told his wife he had been at the University of Georgia looking for work that day. His wife, frustrated and fed up, kept telling him to tell the truth. "I want you to tell me the truth," she said again and again during that call. And finally, there was the testimony about Ibarra's brother, Diego. A woman named Stephanie Slayton lived in the same apartment complex. On the night of Lakin's murder, Diego approached her and asked about the police activity near their apartment's dumpster. She told him someone had passed away in the back of our apartment. She said if he knew anything, he should tell the police. According to Slayton, Diego used a translation app to write to her in English. "If you tell them, I would tell them that you did it, and then I will kill you too." It was a mountain of evidence, circumstantial but collectively damning, all pointing to one person, Jose Antonio Ibarra. 9 months after Lakin Riley's death, in November 2024, Jose Ibarra's trial began in Athens Clarke County Superior Court. He had pleaded not guilty to all charges: malice murder, 3 counts of felony murder, kidnapping with bodily injury, aggravated assault with intent to rape, aggravated battery, obstructing an emergency telephone call, tampering with evidence, and being a peeping Tom. In an unusual move, Ibarra waived his right to a jury trial. The decision would rest entirely with Superior Court Judge H. Patrick Haggard, who would hear the evidence and render a verdict. The trial began on Friday, November 15th. The courtroom was packed with Lakin's family, friends, and roommates. Her mother, Allison Phillips, sat in the front rows, often with her hands covering her face. Beside her, family members passed tissues back and forth as the evidence was presented. Prosecutor Sheila Ross delivered the opening statement. "The evidence will show that Lakin fought," she said, her voice steady and clear. "She fought for her life. She fought for her dignity. And in that fight, she caused this defendant to leave forensic evidence behind." Ross laid out the state's theory. Jose Ibarra had gone hunting for females on the University of Georgia campus that morning. When he encountered Lakin Riley, he tried to rape her. She refused. She fought, and because she fought, he killed her. The defense attorney, Dustin Kirby, acknowledged that Riley's death was a tragedy. He called the evidence graphic and disturbing, but he argued the evidence was circumstantial. "The evidence that Jose Ibarra killed Lakin Riley is circumstantial," he said. "If the presumption of innocence is respected, there should not be enough evidence to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Ibarra is guilty of the crimes charged." Over the next 3 days, prosecutors called more than 24 witnesses. Law enforcement officers described finding Lakin's body and the subsequent investigation. Forensic experts explained the DNA evidence, the fingerprint analysis, the cell phone data. FBI specialists testified about location tracking and surveillance footage. Lakin's roommates took the stand, many of them in tears. They described her as someone who was always on time, always thoughtful, always present. Connolly Hoof, who used to run with Lakin, said she had lost the joy of what running was before Lakin was taken from us. The University of Georgia Police Sergeant Sophie Raboud testified about Lakin's final communications from her phone. The timeline she presented was heartbreaking. The text to her mother at 8:55, the unanswered call at 9:03, the increasingly frantic text from Allison Phillips as the morning wore on. "You're making me nervous not answering while you're out running. Are you okay?" Lakin's mother had written, her worry growing with each passing hour. The body camera footage from Sergeant Kenneth Maxwell was played in court. The moment he found Lakin's body, the gasp of horror, the desperate attempt to perform CPR even though he must have known it was too late. Several people in the courtroom sobbed audibly as the video played. Dr. Michelle DiMarco, the medical examiner who performed Lakin's autopsy, testified about her findings. 8 cuts to the left side of Lakin's head, a complex skull fracture, injuries to her face, the combined effects of blunt force trauma, likely from a rock. DiMarco said, an asphyxiation, no signs of sexual assault, but clear signs of an attempted rape based on how her clothing had been disturbed. On Tuesday, November 19th, the prosecution rested its case. The defense called only 3 witnesses. One was a man named Joseph Clementi, who had been jogging near the crime scene around 9:39 that morning. He testified that he saw someone in dark clothing who seemed out of place, someone who appeared to be wandering rather than exercising. The defense tried to use his testimony to suggest that someone else might have been in the area, but on cross-examination, the timeline didn't support their theory. Clementi saw this person after Lakin's heart had already stopped. The defense tried to suggest that Diego Ibarra, not Jose, might have been the killer. They pointed out that the brothers shared clothes, that they shared a bed in their tiny apartment, that 3 gloves had been found in the dumpster, suggesting, they argued, multiple people might have been involved. But the forensic evidence was clear. The DNA under Lakin's fingernails matched Jose, not Diego. The thumbprint on Lakin's phone matched Jose, not Diego. On Wednesday morning, November 20th, Jose Ibarra chose not to testify in his own defense. His attorneys rested their case. During closing arguments, prosecutor Sheila Ross stood before Judge Haggard and laid out her case one final time. "The evidence in this case has been overwhelming," she said, "and the evidence in this case has spoken loud and clear that he is Lakin Riley's killer, and that he killed her because she would not let him rape her." She recounted the forensic evidence, the surveillance footage, the cell phone data, the DNA. "Lakin Riley herself has given you all the evidence you need," Ross said, her voice rising with emotion. "The physical evidence is sufficient and is corroborated by forensic, digital, and video evidence to twist this very powerful knot that this defendant cannot get out of. There is no way out for him." Defense attorney Cara Beck made one last attempt to raise reasonable doubt. She urged the judge to be skeptical of the DNA evidence, to consider the possibility that Diego Ibarra was the real killer, and Jose was merely an accomplice who helped dispose of evidence. Under that theory, of course, Jose would be guilty of tampering, she said. But that theory does not prove that he was present or involved in the murder of Lakin Riley. But Judge Haggard, who had listened carefully to every word of testimony, who had examined every piece of evidence, was not persuaded. After hearing closing arguments, he announced he would render his verdict immediately. The courtroom fell silent. Lakin's family leaned forward in their seats. Jose Ibarra, wearing headphones for translation, stared straight ahead. Judge Haggard began to speak. "On the charge of malice murder, guilty. On the first count of felony murder, guilty. On the second count of felony murder, guilty. On the third count of felony murder, guilty. On the charge of kidnapping with bodily injury, guilty. Aggravated assault with intent to rape, guilty. Aggravated battery, guilty. Obstructing an emergency telephone call, guilty. Tampering with evidence, guilty. Being a peeping Tom, guilty. Guilty on all 10 counts." The moment the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in sobs, some of relief, most of grief. Lakin's mother covered her face with her hands. Her stepfather, John Phillips, put his arm around her. In the gallery, Lakin's friends and roommates cried openly. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The moment when someone was finally held accountable for taking their friend away. But no verdict, no sentence could bring Lakin back. Judge Haggard moved immediately to sentencing. The prosecution had not sought the death penalty, so the question before the court was whether Ibarra would receive life in prison with the possibility of parole, or life without parole. Before the sentence was handed down, Lakin's family and friends were given the opportunity to address the court through victim impact statements. One by one, they stood and spoke about what Lakin had meant to them, about the hole her death had left in their lives. Lakin's stepfather, John Phillips, read aloud from Lakin's journal, an entry from December 2023, just 2 months before her death. In it, Lakin had written a letter to her future husband, a practice her small group leader had recommended. To my future husband, Phillips read, his voice cracking with emotion. As silly as I feel writing this, my old small group leader once recommended it, so here I am. To my future husband, I want you to know that I'm thinking about you. The letter went on, filled with Lakin's hopes for her future, her faith, her dreams of the life she wanted to build. Phillips noted how Lakin's life was abundantly and exceptionally full of promise. He looked directly at Ibarra and said, I plead with this court to protect the world from this truly evil person, by sentencing him to prison for life without the possibility of parole for any reason, so that he could never have the opportunity to do this to anyone else ever again. Lakin's mother, Allison Phillips, spoke next. This monster took away our chances to see Lakin graduate from nursing school, she said, her voice thick with grief. He took away our ability to meet our future son-in-law. He destroyed our chances of meeting our grandchildren, and he took my best friend. She paused, gathering herself. He took away every beautiful memory we won't ever be able to make with her again. She spoke about Lakin's faith, her kindness, her dedication to helping others. She was smart, hardworking, kind, thoughtful, and most importantly, she was a child of God, Allison said. She had a personal relationship with Jesus, and she loved being his hands and feet in this world. Lakin's younger sister, Lauren Phillips, described how Lakin would send her good morning texts and funny videos every day. The true sense of joy I felt when she would randomly surprise me will never happen again, she said. She called Lakin her biggest supporter. Lakin's roommates spoke about the routines they'd shared, running together, eating family dinners, watching Dancing with the Stars every week, talking about what life would be like after graduation. Sophia Magana described how, the day before her death, Lakin had woken up early despite having an early clinical rotation, just to decorate Sophia's bedroom door with streamers and balloons for her birthday. I woke up on February 21st at 7:30 a.m., walked out of my bedroom door to streamers hung outside of my bedroom. From the top of the door frame to the floor, balloons blown, decorations taped, and gifts presented precisely on my kitchen island, Sophia said. Lakin did it. It was my 22nd birthday. Prosecutor Sheila Ross urged Judge Haggard to impose a sentence that brings comfort to this community and appropriately reflects the harm that was done in this case. She asked for the maximum life without the possibility of parole. The defense asked for life with the possibility of parole. Getting a life sentence is automatic, defense attorney John Dongley said. There's certainly no guarantee of parole. He added that given Ibarra's immigration status, if he were ever released, it would only be to be deported. Judge Haggard considered the arguments. Then he announced his decision. Jose Antonio Ibarra would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In addition, he imposed 49 more years to be served consecutively for the other convictions. Jose Ibarra would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He would never again walk freely. He would never again hunt in those woods. He would never again have the opportunity to harm another young woman the way he had harmed Lakin Riley. Lakin Riley's death resonated far beyond Athens, Georgia. Within hours of the news breaking, her case became a flashpoint in the national debate over immigration policy. Republican politicians seized on the fact that Jose Ibarra had entered the country illegally and had been released under the parole system. They blamed the Biden administration's border policies for Lakin's death. During President Biden's State of the Union address in March 2024, Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene interrupted the speech and shouted, "Say her name," referring to Lakin, Biden responded by saying Laken Riley was an innocent woman who was killed by an elite, he added. To her parents, I say my heart goes out to you, having lost children myself. I understand. The Republican-controlled House of Representatives passed what they called the Laken Riley Act, legislation that would require ICE to detain undocumented immigrants accused of committing theft-related crimes like shoplifting. The bill was named after Laken, though her family never asked for it to be. The act became a rallying cry for stricter immigration enforcement. It initially stalled in 2024, but was eventually signed into law by President Donald Trump in January 2025, after he returned to office. Democrats argued that Republicans were exploiting Laken's death for political gain. Representative Jerry Nadler called it a partisan stunt and said Republicans were throwing together legislation to target immigrants in an election year. Representative Veronica Escobar said, "We all want Laken Riley's murderer to be held accountable, but cautioned against using her death to demonize all immigrants." For immigrant communities in Athens, the case created a painful divide. Many Venezuelan immigrants had fled violence and chaos in their home country, only to find themselves viewed with suspicion because of the actions of one man. They pointed out that millions of immigrants live peaceful, law-abiding lives, working hard to support their families and contribute to their communities. The University of Georgia implemented new safety measures in response to Laken's murder. Emergency blue lights, phones that connect directly to campus police, were installed along the trails where Laken had been running. The university increased police patrols in wooded areas. They offered more safety escorts and encouraged students never to run or walk alone in isolated areas, especially early in the morning or late at night. But for all the policy debates, for all the legislation and the political speeches and the safety measures, none of it brought Laken back. And none of it gave her family the future they'd imagined with her. None of it gave her friends another chance to run together on those trails, to watch Dancing with the Stars, to celebrate birthdays with homemade decorations. Laken Riley's funeral was held on March 1st, 2024, at Woodstock City Church. Hundreds of people attended to say goodbye to a young woman whose life had been full of promise, whose future had been stolen far too soon. She was buried at Enn Cemetery in Woodstock, Georgia, at Lake Eric, where she'd spent so many happy moments with her roommates. A memorial was created in her honor. People left running shoes, flowers, and handwritten notes. Her family established the Laken Hope Riley Foundation to honor her memory and carry on her legacy of service and compassion. They started an online fund to support the foundation's work. She will be missed every day. Her stepfather said, "But we promise to honor her life moving forward in a very big way." Those who knew Laken described her as someone who embodied her Christian faith in everything she did. She'd gone on a mission trip to Honduras in 2019 and posted about how God used me in ways I couldn't even imagine. In her journal, she'd written about wanting to be his hands and feet in this world. She was studying nursing because she wanted to help people, to make a difference, to heal. She was the kind of person who made birthday surprises for her roommates, even when she was exhausted from early clinical rotations. She was the kind of person who sent good morning texts to her sister every single day without fail. She was the kind of person who ran not just for fitness, but for peace, for clarity, for connection with something larger than herself. She was 22 years old. She was on the dean's list. She was training for her first marathon. She had a future husband she'd never meet, grandchildren who would never be born, patients she would never care for, lives she would never touch with her kindness and compassion. All of that was taken away in 25 minutes on a cold February morning by a man who saw her not as a person, but as a target, an opportunity, something to be hunted. In the quiet moments after a case like this concludes, after the verdict is read and the sentence is handed down and the news cameras move on to the next story, the questions remain. Could this have been prevented? If Jose Ibarra had been detained after his shoplifting arrest in October, if the bench warrant had been executed in December, would Laken Riley still be alive? If immigration authorities had issued a detainer when he was arrested in New York, would he have been in Athens at all? What about the broader failures? The fake green card that allowed Diego Ibarra to work on a university campus, the lack of follow-through on criminal charges, the gaps in the immigration system that allowed someone to move from New York to Georgia without reporting the change of address, the absence of emergency call boxes on a trail where young women regularly jogged alone. But perhaps the biggest question is one that has no answer, one that haunts anyone who has ever felt unsafe walking alone. jogging alone, existing alone in public space. Why do women have to be afraid? Laken Riley was not the first woman killed while running. She won't be the last. In 2018, Molly Tibbetts, a 20-year-old college student in Iowa, was murdered while jogging. In 2016, Karina Vetrano was killed while running in Queens, New York. The stories are depressingly similar. Young women, alone, exercising in daylight, encountering men who saw them as prey. Women are told constantly to be careful. Don't run alone. Don't run in the dark. Don't run in isolated areas. Tell someone where you're going. Share your location. Carry pepper spray. Take self-defense classes. Vary your route. Don't wear headphones. Stay alert. Be aware of your surroundings. Laken Riley did many of those things. She shared her location with her roommates. She wore a smartwatch that tracked her location. She ran on a trail she knew well, on a university campus, in broad daylight, and still she wasn't safe. The burden of safety is placed on women, on their choices, their precautions, their awareness. But the problem isn't that women aren't careful enough. The problem is that there are men who hunt them. As this story comes to a close, it's late at night or perhaps early morning, and you're listening to this in the darkness. Perhaps trying to fall asleep, perhaps simply trying to understand how something like this could happen. And maybe you're thinking about Laken Riley, about her morning routine, her text to her mother, her AirPods and her running shoes, the birthday decorations she made for her roommate just hours before her death. She was planning her weekend. She was studying nursing. She was texting her sister. She was living a life that felt safe, predictable, full of possibility. And then, in an instant, all of that was gone. Jose Ibarra is now in prison for the rest of his life. He will never walk free again. Judge Haggard made certain of that. But justice, as complete as it was in this case, doesn't feel like enough. It never does. Because Laken's family still wakes up every morning without her. Her mother still reaches for her phone to call her daughter, forgetting for just a moment that the line will never be answered. Her sister no longer receives those good morning texts. Her roommates run on different trails now, if they run at all. The dock by Lake Herrick, where Laken and her friends used to end their runs, sits quiet now. The memorial flowers have faded. Life at the University of Georgia has moved forward, as it always does, with new students filling the dorms and new runners hitting the trails. But for those who knew her, for those who loved her, time stopped on February 22nd, 2024 at 9:28 in the morning. Laken Hope Riley was 22 years old. She loved Jesus. She loved her family. She loved running. She wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to help people. She wanted to live. And that's what we should remember most about this case. Not the politics, not the debates, not even the details of the crime itself. What we should remember is a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, white sneakers laced tight, heading out for a morning run with her whole life ahead of her. We should remember that she fought. We should remember that she mattered. We should remember her name. Laken Hope Riley. Rest in peace. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care.